Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 2. The North Cascades loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette framed against an early morning sky, which was fading from grey to a soft, sickly blue. Alec stood on the edge of the trail, the air biting his skin, the faint scent of pine needles mixing with the sharp, musty odour of wet earth. The mountains were always like this, foreboding and distant, beautiful in their cruelty, and indifferent to anyone who dared to challenge them. Alec had made the climb countless times before. The rough terrain and unpredictable weather were hardly new to him. He'd always known the risks. But this ascent, in particular, seemed to carry a weight. He couldn't quite shake the feeling, a quiet pressure in his chest that hadn't been there on any of his previous climbs. He pushed the thought away, determined to not let it deter him. He'd been climbing the North Cascades for years, and though the mountain had claimed others before, it had never claimed him. Not yet, at least. As he continued up the narrow trail, his boots crunching against the frost-kissed ground, Alec's mind wandered. His life had been a steady rhythm of solitary climbs and fleeting encounters with others, brief exchanges in small towns, moments of camaraderie before he disappeared back into the mountains, into the quiet. The solitude had suited him. It always had. But something had changed. It wasn't just the way the mountains seemed to draw him closer, almost with a magnetic pull. It was more than that. His thoughts had become darker, more fragmented, and at times, he felt the presence of something that wasn't there, something watching, waiting. But he couldn't put it into words. It was an ache in his gut, a hollow feeling that gnawed at him, something that had crept in over the past few months, after the death of his younger brother, Noah. Alec didn't talk about Noah much. He'd been the one who'd always been the steady anchor in their family, always the one to shoulder the burden. But when Noah had died, tragically, suddenly, Alec had spiraled. His brother's death had thrown everything into question, and Alec had felt adrift ever since. The mountains had always been his sanctuary, but now, as he hiked higher into the Cascades, he wondered if even the mountains would provide solace this time. The wind picked up as he neared the summit, tugging at his gear and threatening to push him back. The weather in the Cascades was notorious for changing in an instant, and Alec had learned long ago to trust the mountain's mood. He checked his watch, 3:22 p.m. He had just over an hour of daylight left, and the weather was turning ominous. The clouds overhead were thickening, moving swiftly like a storm-gathering force. The first distant rumble of thunder reached his ears, faint but insistent. Alec paused. He could see the summit just ahead, a mere half-mile or so, but the storm was coming in fast. His instincts screamed at him to turn around. He had climbed enough to know when the mountain was warning him, when it was ready to claim its due. This wasn't a climb to be taken lightly, especially alone. The wind howled, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in a matter of moments. Reluctantly, Alec decided to descend. He turned on his heel and started back down the trail, pushing through the wet underbrush. The storm rolled in with a vengeance, and the sky darkened as if the heavens themselves were closing in on him. The clouds churned and twisted, flickering with a growing fury, and the first cracks of thunder split the air, followed by the sharp stabs of lightning. The wind intensified, whipping around him with a violent fury that threatened to knock him off balance with each step. As Alec descended the treacherous path, his mind raced. Should he have turned back earlier? Maybe he should have just pushed through to the summit. The thought lingered, but it was drowned out by the increasing roar of the storm. The deafening crack of thunder so close it rattled his bones. He checked his GPS, trying to keep track of his position, but the device blinked erratically, its signal interrupted by the storm's wrath. Alec cursed under his breath. The temperature continued to drop. His breath became visible in the frigid air, the cold gnawing at his exposed skin. His boots slid on the wet stones, the trail now a treacherous river of mud. Alec fought to keep his footing, but the mountain, it seemed, was fighting back. He could feel it in the air. Something wasn't right. Then through the haze of rain and the curtain of fog that now enveloped him, he saw it. A shape, something out of place. The outline of a cabin, sitting precariously on a rocky ledge, as though it had grown there from the earth itself, its edges softened by the mist and rain. Alec squinted. He had been on this trail a dozen times, yet he had never seen this cabin before. It didn't belong here. There was no cabin marked on any of the maps he had studied before his climb. No path leading to it. Nothing. He approached slowly, wariness creeping in with each step. The storm was relentless now, battering him with rain, the wind shrieking in his ears as if urging him to turn back. The cabin was small, weathered, but somehow inviting. Its windows dark and empty, the door slightly ajar as if beckoning him inside. Alec hesitated. The unease he'd been feeling ever since he had lost Noah washed over him again. It had been with him on every climb he'd done since that fateful day. Just a feeling that he was being drawn into something bigger than him. But the storm, the cold, the wind, they left him with few options. He knocked on the door. The hollow sound echoed into the mountain, but it was drowned out by the storm. There was no response. The wind whipped against him, and the cold seeped into his bones. The door creaked open on its own. Alec stared at it for a moment, confusion swirling with a strange, creeping dread. Should he enter? Should he find shelter and wait out the storm? The wind howled louder, pushing him forward. He stepped inside, the warm air inside the cabin washing over him like a blanket. The contrast between the blistering cold outside and the cabin's interior was jarring, and for a moment Alec felt himself relax, but it was fleeting. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, wooden beams lining the ceiling, a worn rug on the floor. A small table sat in the center of the room, meticulously arranged with a steaming cup of coffee. Beside it, there was a dry set of clothes, a thick sweater, pants, socks, and boots, all in his exact size. Alec's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to make of it. Had someone been here? Who could have possibly known he was coming? The thought of the storm raging outside made the idea of leaving unappealing, but the strange presence of the cabin left him unsettled. His mind raced for an explanation. Had someone left this here for him? His fingers brushed the fabric of the clothes. The material was warm, almost unnaturally so. The coffee in the mug had not cooled, steam rising from it despite the storm's chill. He glanced at the table, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any other signs of life. But there was nothing. The silence of the place was deafening, broken only by the rumbling thunder and the occasional crash of wind outside. Alec's gaze shifted to the corner of the room where an old journal sat, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. He took a step toward it, drawn by some invisible force, and his fingers hovered above the pages. As he opened it, the faint smell of ink and old paper filled the air. The first few pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting, entries describing climbs, weather patterns, and difficult trails. But it was the last entry that stopped Alec's heart. It was written in his own handwriting. The last words were simple. "I should have left when I had the chance. I'll never leave. It has already taken me." Alec stumbled back from the table, the journal slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Something was very wrong. The storm outside grew louder, the wind screeching like the sound of 1,000 voices. And in the silence that followed, Alec heard a soft, almost imperceptible creak from the far side of the cabin. Something or someone was in the shadows, and Alec was trapped. Alec's heart hammered in his chest, the words on the journal page spinning in his mind like a maddening whirlpool. He felt a cold bead of sweat run down his temple as his gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of what had just moved in the shadows. The storm raged outside, its fury now a constant roar, but the cabin, despite the howling winds, was eerily still. The air inside felt almost too thick, as though something in the atmosphere had shifted, something suffocating. Alec's breath quickened, each inhalation shallow as he backed away from the table, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. He told himself to stay calm, to think logically, but logic felt like a fragile thread unraveling in his mind. The journal had been written in his own hand, his own handwriting. How was that possible? Had someone been here before? Had they climbed this very mountain and left a message for him? But why? A sharp crack of thunder shook the cabin, the air vibrating with the sound, and Alec flinched. It felt like the storm itself had grown more malevolent, more aggressive. The thunder wasn't just a sound now. It felt like a warning, like the mountain itself was shaking in anger. The cup of coffee on the table, still steaming as though it had just been poured, beckoned him like a cruel invitation. He had half a mind to drink it, to calm his nerves, but something about it seemed wrong. The idea of touching it, of bringing it to his lips, felt forbidden, as though by doing so he might cross a line he couldn't return from. Instead, Alec turned away from the table, his eyes scanning the cabin, searching for an exit. The door was still open, the wind howling outside like a living thing, but the path leading back to the mountain was hidden in the dense fog and rain. He knew he had no choice but to leave this place, but the unease that crawled up his spine made every movement feel agonizingly slow. As he moved toward the door, the floorboards creaked underfoot, each step louder than the last. He reached for the doorframe, his fingers brushing against the splintered wood, but before he could take another step, a low, guttural sound came from behind him. A soft whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a wave of ice through Alec's veins. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The air around him seemed to thicken, the storm outside muffling into a distant hum, as though the cabin itself had swallowed the outside world whole. The whispering continued, low and insistent, like a voice trying to reach him from the other side of the room. Alec. The sound of his name sent a shudder through his body. No one was here. No one had entered. No one had spoken. He was alone, wasn't he? The whisper grew louder, clearer. The words, though faint, were unmistakable. I've been waiting. The voice, now unmistakably human but unnatural in its rasp, seemed to come from the very walls, the wood itself. It was as though the cabin itself was alive, breathing, murmuring, its secrets into the corners of Alec's mind. His heart raced faster, and for a moment the air felt too tight, as though the walls were closing in around him. He spun toward the corner of the room where the voice had come from, but nothing, no one was there. The shadows clung to the edges of the cabin, dark and oppressive, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Alec's mind screamed at him to leave, to flee this place before whatever was here could get a hold of him. But then his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. The mirror. It hung in the far corner, its surface old, tarnished with age. It was almost imperceptible at first, blending into the dim lighting of the room. But now Alec saw it clearly, and he could feel something in that reflection that made his stomach twist. There was a strange stillness to it, something that felt wrong, as if the mirror wasn't reflecting the cabin properly. Slowly, with reluctant steps, Alec approached it. Each movement felt sluggish, weighed down by the strange pressure in the air. As he drew closer, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled, The reflection in the mirror seemed off. His own reflection was there, but distorted in subtle ways. His face appeared hollow, sunken as though it had been drained of life. His eyes were empty, black pools staring back at him with a familiarity that unsettled him to his core. For a moment he thought the reflection blinked. Alex stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. No, it was just the lighting, just the shadows playing tricks on his mind. The storm outside had clearly begun to get to him, to rattle his nerves. He needed to leave. But before he could move, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, throwing the cabin into sudden darkness. The wind, which had been howling through the gap in the door, was now silenced. It was as if the mountain had swallowed the storm whole. Alex's pulse quickened. The silence was absolute. No rain, no wind, no thunder. Only the heavy, oppressive quiet that felt as though it had been waiting for him. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in on him as he struggled to breathe. The weight of the atmosphere felt like an invisible hand tightening around his chest. He could no longer hear the storm. He could no longer hear anything outside of the cabin. His thoughts felt disjointed, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The "I" whisper came again, this time louder, closer. "Alec, you've been here before." His head snapped toward the source of the voice. He couldn't see anyone, but he felt the words penetrate him like a cold knife. The voice, now unmistakable, was coming from the very walls, reverberating through the floorboards. It was as though the cabin itself was speaking directly to him. "You will never leave," the voice whispered. "Not again." The words hit Alec like a physical blow. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as his pulse raced. This was no longer just a cabin. It wasn't just an empty, forgotten shelter. The mountain itself had a presence, a force that was not merely passive, but actively aware of him, of his presence, of his guilt, his grief, and it had been waiting. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had to get out. But the door had shut, and he couldn't escape. He turned toward the window, but it was just as dark outside. The rain had stopped, but the fog had thickened, and the air beyond the glass was impenetrable. He could barely make out the faintest outline of the world outside, swallowed by the dense, wet mist. Another creak, louder this time. Alec felt the presence again, something behind him. Someone in the room with him. His instincts screamed at him to run, to break through the door, to do something before it was too late. But his legs were rooted to the floor, his feet unwilling to move. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It had become a prison. And Alec could feel the weight of that truth settling over him like a shroud, suffocating and heavy. He was not alone, and whatever was in this place, whatever had been waiting, wasn't done with him yet. The silence in the cabin pressed down on Alec like a physical force, each breath harder to take than the last. The very air around him seemed charged with a dark energy, something unnatural that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up straight. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to escape, to run, to do anything other than remain here. But his body refused to obey. He stood frozen, his feet heavy as lead, unwilling to take the next step, knowing deep down that every movement he made could pull him deeper into the suffocating grip of this place. The whisper came again, louder this time, as though something was right behind him. He could feel the words curling around his spine, slithering into his mind like a parasite. "Alec, I have been waiting." The voice was so close now that it felt like the words were spoken directly into his ear. Alec's heart stuttered, and the breath he'd been holding rushed out in a gasp. He spun around, his eyes frantic, but there was nothing, no one, in the dim cabin. The room was empty. The only sound was the thumping of his heart in his chest and the soft creaking of the old wood under his feet. but Alec could feel it in the air, in the very walls themselves, a presence. The cabin was alive, and it was watching him. He stumbled backward, eyes darting frantically to the door, but the door was no longer just shut. It was locked. He hadn't heard the click, hadn't seen the movement, but now it was unmistakable. The door was sealed, the rusty iron handle refusing to budge. The window, once clear and open to the storm's fury, was now opaque, fogged up, the glass clouded as though the very essence of the cabin had sealed off the outside world. Alec's breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. His pulse was racing in his ears, drowning out the growing whispers, the soft rustle of movement around him that seemed to come from every direction. He stumbled toward the table, his hands shaking as he grabbed the journal once again. The familiar, ancient smell of ink and worn leather filled his nostrils. He flipped through the pages with trembling fingers, desperately seeking any explanation, any clue that could make sense of what was happening. But the entries grew more frantic, more disjointed, as if the writer's sanity had slowly unraveled the longer they stayed in this place. Do not stay here, it will take you. Time does not exist here. Leave before it claims you. The last entry, the one written in his own hand, burned into his mind like a brand. His own handwriting. It was too familiar, too unsettling. He had written those words, hadn't he? But how? How could he have known? How could he have... A sound broke through his thoughts. A loud thud coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. Alec froze. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of dragging. Something heavy, scraping against the floor. Slowly, hesitantly, Alec turned toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the cabin. His eyes strained against the dark, searching for any movement, any sign of what was making the sound. But the shadows seemed to writhe and shift in the corners of the room, dancing in the flickering light from the single oil lamp on the table. Another thud, closer now. Alec's legs moved before his mind could catch up, and he found himself creeping toward the hallway. His boots made no sound as he moved, and for a fleeting moment, it almost felt like the cabin had swallowed the noise, as if it were protecting the silence, protecting whatever was lurking in the dark. He reached the threshold of the hallway. The air was thick here, even more oppressive than the room he had just left. A faint smell lingered, something metallic and sour, like blood that had been left to rot. Another thud, and then the dragging sound, this time unmistakable. It was coming from further down the hallway, from a door at the far end that Alec had not noticed before. It was cracked open, just a sliver, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Alec's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of dread. His hands trembled, the journal still clutched tightly in his grasp. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave, to flee from whatever was making that sound. But curiosity, miserable, dark curiosity, pulled him forward. He reached out a hand, touching the doorframe, feeling the cold wood beneath his fingertips. He pushed the door open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. As the door swung inward, the dragging sound ceased. The room beyond was pitch black, but Alec could make out vague shapes. His eyes adjusted to the dimness, and he stepped inside. The air in the room was stale, thick with the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he slowly moved further in, his heart thudding louder with each step. And then, in the faintest glimmer of light from the hallway, he saw it. A figure, hunched over in the far corner, draped in tattered, dark cloth. It looked like a person, but something about it was wrong. Wrong in a way that made Alec's skin crawl. Its back was to him, its head bent forward, and Alec couldn't see its face, though he could feel its presence, like an ice-cold hand pressing against the back of his neck. The dragging sound had stopped, but the figure remained still, as if waiting for him to speak or to move. Alec's breath caught in his throat. He had to leave. He had to turn around, get back to the cabin's main room, and break the door open, with all his strength. But his body refused to obey. His legs felt like stone, frozen in place as he stared at the figure. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure moved. It shifted, slow and deliberate, its body creaking and cracking, as if it were a ragged puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Alec felt his body seize with fear, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. He couldn't look away. The figure turned, revealing its face. Alec gasped, stumbling back. The face, if it could be called that, was a twisted, hollow parody of a human face. Eyes that were too wide, too vacant, black as the void itself, and a mouth stretched open in a grotesque, gaping grin that seemed to curl back into itself, as if it were trying to swallow the world. The skin was ashen, cracked and peeling, as though it had not been touched by sunlight in centuries. The figure's lips moved, and the same voice, his voice, whispered, "Alec, you found me." The words were like a chill running through his veins, freezing his blood. Alec stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing. His breath came in ragged gasps. How could this be? How could it be him? But before he could process the thought, the figure took a step forward, its feet dragging across the floor like the scraping of bones on stone. Alec turned and ran. The floorboards beneath him cracked as he bolted back toward the hallway, his breath ragged in his throat. The door to the cabin's main room, was just ahead. He reached for the handle, his fingers slipping on the cold metal, but he couldn't get it to budge. Panic surged in his chest as he pulled harder, yanking at the door, but it remained sealed shut, mocking him. The whisper came again, louder now, the voice growing harsher, more insistent. "Alec, you cannot leave." Suddenly the world around him began to shift, the walls warping and stretching. The room he was in grew darker, the shadows coming alive, as if the very structure of the cabin was folding in on itself. Alec felt himself being pulled, not just physically but mentally, pulled into something dark, something that was waiting to claim him. His mind reeled, struggling to hold on to any semblance of reality. And then, in the midst of the terror, a thought flickered into his mind. This isn't the first time. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been here before. He had done this before. The mountain had not just taken Noah, it had taken him too. Alec collapsed to the floor as the room around him twisted and morphed into darkness, the last remnants of his sanity fading into the void, and the whisper, the voice was the last thing he heard before everything disappeared. "Alec, you are mine now." The darkness swallowed him whole. Alec's eyes snapped open, the world around him shifting like a fevered dream. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he struggled to push himself up from the cold wooden floor. But his body felt foreign, heavy and disconnected, as if it no longer belonged to him. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and his head ached with a painful pressure, as if something was pressing in from all sides. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. His mind was clouded, foggy, but as the world slowly came back into focus, he recognized the room around him. The cabin. He was back in the same room where he had been moments, or was it hours, before. The table was still there, the steaming coffee still resting on it, the journal beside it, its pages open as if waiting for him to read. The soft light from the oil lamp flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. But something had changed. The air felt wrong, dense and oppressive, like it had absorbed every breath he'd ever taken, every whisper, every secret. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. His mind reeled with the last images, the last whispers, the figure, the face, his own voice in the dark. Was he losing his mind? He slowly sat up, shaking the dizziness from his head, his hands trembling as they reached for the journal. the same familiar leather cover, the same worn pages. His fingers traced the edges of the paper as if hoping that somehow they could anchor him to the present, to reality. He flipped through the pages again, this time with more urgency. He had to understand. There had to be an explanation for all of this. His eyes scanned the words, his own handwriting standing out starkly against the rest of the entries. The last entry had changed. There were no longer just frantic warnings or the cryptic messages urging him to leave. This time, the words were calm, calculated, as though they had been written with a clear mind. You will come to me. We will both be one. The mountain claims all who seek it. You will not escape. There is no escape. A chill ran down Alec's spine. It was as if the mountain itself had spoken through him, his own hand compelled to write something he didn't fully understand. His stomach twisted with a growing sense of dread. Was this truly him? Had he written this? Or had something else, someone else, taken control? He dropped the journal, his hands shaking violently. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. Alec scrambled to his feet, his breath quickening as the whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder, filling the cabin with their chilling presence. They weren't just words. They were commands, whispers of something ancient, something buried deep within the mountain. The air seemed to thrum with the force of it, vibrating around him, pushing against him, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive, feeding on his fear, drawing closer with every breath he took. Alec. The voice was soft, familiar, too familiar. He spun around, but the room was empty. His reflection in the mirror, however, was not. It stood there, staring at him from the corner, its gaze locked with his. The reflection of Alec was not quite right. It was distorted, like a mirror that had been cracked and poorly mended. His face appeared older, worn and drawn, the once familiar features now hollow, like a corpse. But it was the eyes that unsettled him the most. They weren't his eyes. They were cold, dark, empty, devoid of life, just like the figure in the hallway. The reflection smiled. Alec's heart skipped a beat. The smile was slow, deliberate, stretching across the mirrored face, a grin that seemed far too wide, too knowing. It was not his smile. The reflection spoke. You've finally realized it, haven't you? The voice that echoed from the mirror was his own. But it was wrong. Slippery, like it had come from somewhere deep within him. Somewhere he didn't want to acknowledge. You're here, and you will always be here. The reflection continued, its grin widening until it felt like the entire room was filled with its malevolent presence. Alec backed away slowly, his hands clutched to his chest, his breath ragged. He had to leave. He couldn't stay. But the door was still locked. His feet dragged against the floor as if some invisible force was holding him in place. You can't leave, Alec, the reflection whispered, its voice a hiss now, sharp and menacing. You're already part of me, part of this place, part of us. Alec's head was spinning and the room felt like it was tilting. The shadows seemed to pulse, swelling and contracting as though the very essence of the cabin was breathing. He could hear it now, faintly, in the distance, a soft, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. No. Alec's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. No, I'm not like you. I'm not part of this. But the reflection only chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Oh, but you are. You always were, the mirror began, to distort, warping in ways that defied logic. It rippled like water, the image of Alec shifting, twisting, becoming something else entirely. The figure in the reflection reached out toward him, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, grasping for him. Alec's body froze. The figure's hand was so close now, just inches from his own. He could feel the coldness radiating from the glass, could feel its pull, its hunger. The cabin itself felt alive, its walls closing in, trapping him in a place where time seemed to stretch and warp, where the past and present bled into one another, indistinguishable. "You can't escape," the reflection said, its voice soft now, almost loving. "You will never escape. I've been waiting for you." With a violent jolt, Alec broke free from his paralysis, stumbling backward, his legs finally responding to the panic flooding his system. He turned and ran, his hands flailing for the door, desperate to get out of this suffocating place. But it was no use. The door was no longer a door, it was a wall. The smooth wooden surface had shifted, transformed into a solid mass, as if the mountain itself had sealed him in. Alec slammed his fists against it, his breath coming in panicked gasps, the weight of despair pressing in on him. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder now, reverberating off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They were everywhere, inside. His mind, inside his skin, crawling into his ears and slipping through his thoughts. "I have always been here, Alec. You cannot run from me. You cannot outrun yourself." Alec's heart thundered in his chest as the realization hit him harder than the storm outside. The voice, the thing, was not something external. It was not a presence from beyond the mountain. It was him. A part of himself that had been buried deep, locked away. But now it had surfaced. It had always been waiting for him, lying in wait for the moment when he would find the cabin. The other Alec, the one in the reflection, smiled again, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You've come home, Alec," it said softly, its voice now dripping with something dark and terrible. "And now you will never leave." Alec collapsed to his knees, his mind spinning, his thoughts collapsing inward. He was trapped in this place, trapped in himself. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the slow, steady pulse, the heartbeat of the cabin, and in that moment he realized with sickening clarity that the heartbeat was his own. The silence that followed Alec's collapse was suffocating. His body trembled uncontrollably, his mind fighting to hold on to the fragments of sanity that were quickly slipping away. The room felt like a tomb, the air thick and stale, pressing down on him with the weight of 1,000 years. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. His head swam with the sounds of whispers, soft and persistent, lapping at the edges of his consciousness like waves on the shore, always there, always just out of reach. The reflection, in the mirror, the other Alec hadn't been lying. The truth was undeniable now. This place had been waiting for him, had drawn him here, and there was no running from it. There was no escaping. Alec. The voice was so close now, a soft murmur that seemed to echo inside his very soul. The words were a caress, an invitation, the breath of the mountain itself speaking to him in the dark. "You've always known, haven't you?" Alec's eyes darted toward the mirror again, his vision blurry from exhaustion, from the crushing pressure that seemed to weigh on his chest. The reflection stared back at him with that same empty, hollow smile, the same cold, dark eyes that were no longer just a reflection of him. They were a part of him, a reflection of something that had always been inside him, lurking, waiting. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear away from the mirror, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if he had no control over it anymore. His fingers twitched involuntarily, his arms falling limp at his sides as he stared into the reflection, as though hypnotized by it, by the darkness in those eyes that was somehow pulling him closer. "Why did you come here, Alec?" The reflection's voice was soft, almost sympathetic now. You always sought the mountains, didn't you? The solitude, the silence. You thought you could escape your grief, your guilt. But it was always with you, always inside you. Alec's mind reeled. His brother, Noah. The reason he had begun climbing in the first place. The guilt, the despair that had driven him to the mountains, seeking solace in their cold embrace. But there had never been solace. There had only been more silence, more isolation, more darkness. "You're wrong," Alec whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't come for this. I just wanted peace." The words barely made it out, lost in the thick, suffocating air that hung heavy in the cabin. His throat felt dry, constricted. The reflection in the mirror seemed to soften for a moment, its cold grin fading as the figure tilted its head, regarding him with an unsettling calm. "Peace," it echoed, as though tasting the word on its tongue. "That's what you sought. Peace. But you never found it, did you? Not here, not in the mountain, not in yourself. You can run, Alec, but you will never escape yourself. Not from the guilt, not from the loss. The mountain, the cabin, the storm, they are not the real prison. You are." Alec's chest tightened at the words. The truth of it was like a stone dropped into the pit of his stomach, heavy and undeniable. The mountain had drawn him here, yes. But it wasn't just the mountain. It was his own mind, his own torment that had led him to this place. The storm, the cabin, the whispers, they were all a reflection of the broken parts of himself he had been running from. The reflection in the mirror stepped closer, and Alec felt his heart race. It was no longer confined to the frame, no longer merely a distorted version of himself. It was now alive, its features stretching, twisting in the mirror, as though the glass itself were bending to its will. Its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, fixed on Alec, and it began to speak again, the voice no longer a whisper but a roar, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. "You can't hide from me. You can't escape me." The words were like a blade, carving through his mind. You can't escape yourself. You never could. Alec clutched his head in his hands, his mind screaming. He wanted to run, but his legs were too weak, too heavy. The reflection, it was him. It was the part of him that had been buried, locked away, the grief and guilt, the fear of what he had lost, and the fear of what he had become. Alec let out a strangled cry, the sound raw and primal, echoing through the cabin. He had been running for so long, chasing a peace that didn't exist, only to find that the very thing he was running from was always with him, inside him. The mountain had never been his enemy. He had been. The pulse in the air, that rhythmic thumping that had filled the cabin, seemed to grow louder now. It was as if the entire world was beating in time with his own heart, as if the mountain was alive, breathing, and it was pulling him in, closing in around him. Then the reflection spoke again, its voice low and filled with a sense of finality. "You have a choice, Alec." The words hung in the air, suspended between them. Alec's breath hitched. A choice? What choice? There was no escape. There was no way out. The reflection's eyes glinted with something cold, something cruel. "You can join me," it whispered. "Join us and become part of the mountain. Become part of this place, part of what we are. The guilt, the grief, the solitude. It will all fade. You will be free." Alec staggered back, his mind reeling from the implications of the words. Join us? The idea made his skin crawl, but a dark part of him, the part he had tried so hard to bury, whispered back, urging him to listen, to accept the offer. The thought of joining the mountain, of becoming part of the very place that had held him captive for so long, was terrifying. But at the same time, it felt like a release, a way to stop fighting, to stop struggling against the inevitable. Or The reflection continued, its voice now dripping with venom. You can keep fighting. Keep resisting, but know this, you will never leave. The mountain will never let you go, not until you accept it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Alec's mind began to fracture, torn between the pull of the reflection and the cold, bitter realization that there was no true escape. The mountain had already claimed him, in ways he hadn't even understood until now. His grief, his guilt, his loneliness, they had all fed it, nurtured it, and now there was nothing left but this twisted choice. The reflection smiled, a dark, knowing smile. Choose, Alec. Choose, before the mountain chooses for you. Alec stood there, torn, his body trembling with the weight of the decision. His entire life had been spent running from the truth. But now, there was no running left. The choice was his. The mountain had made sure of that. The clock was ticking. The pulse of the cabin throbbed louder, faster, like a drumbeat urging him forward. Alec closed his eyes, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. He could feel the pull of the mountain, feel it deep in his bones. And for the first time in his life, he understood. He understood that there was no way out. He had already made his choice. The question was no longer if he would escape the mountain. It was whether he could ever escape himself. Alec's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps as the world around him tilted, warped, and reshaped. The cabin seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heart, the very walls breathing in time with his labored inhales. His head spun, the weight of his decision crushing him from all sides. His body was no longer his own, and his mind was a jagged, fragmented thing, lost between what was real and what had become a sickening mirage. The reflection in the mirror had spoken. The mountain had spoken. But now, in the deafening silence that enveloped him, Alec was no longer sure where he ended and the cabin began. The air itself felt thick with an unseen presence, a force that seemed to be slowly suffocating him, pulling at his limbs, tugging at his consciousness, as though he were being drawn into the very earth beneath the cabin's rotting floorboards. The choice had been made, and Alec had accepted it. In that moment, he knew with a terrible certainty that there was no going back. The mountain had always claimed its own, but now it was claiming him in ways far worse than he could have imagined. A sound, soft but insistent, broke the stillness. A rhythmic, hollow thumping, echoing from beneath the floor, beneath the very foundation of the cabin. Alec stumbled forward, his hands shaking as he reached out to steady himself against the table. The journal sat there untouched, but the weight of it seemed different now, heavier, as though the words within had taken on a new meaning. Alec, the voice whispered again, closer now, seeping through his skin like the cold of the mountain. It was no longer distant or muffled. It was inside him. It was him. You've chosen. You will join us now. The words, spoken with a quiet authority, had a weight to them, a depth. It was not the voice of the reflection anymore, nor the voice from the shadows. It was the voice of the mountain. The mountain, in all its ancient, unknowable power, had woven itself into Alec's very being. It was a presence, a living thing that had always been here, waiting for him patiently to return. The cabin trembled as the voice lingered in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stir, swirling and shifting as though they were alive, reaching for him. Alec's body, too weak to resist, responded to their pull, his limbs moving of their own accord, his feet dragging him closer to the mirror, to the place where the reflection stood. Come to me, the voice whispered again, closer, more intimate. Now, as if it was speaking from inside Alec's own thoughts. He tried to move away, to break free, but his legs felt heavy, bound by invisible chains. The voice had sunk into him, settled deep within his soul. The mirror before him shimmered, its surface warping as though it were made of liquid. Alec's reflection, still twisted, still broken, stretched and distorted until it became something else, something otherworldly. The edges of the glass rippled, and then with a sound like the cracking of ice, the reflection stepped out. The figure was him, or at least it looked like him, but it wasn't. Its face was hollow, its eyes empty, voids, black as the night with no light to reflect back. Its skin too was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and it shimmered with a faint, sickly light. The thing that had once been Alec was no longer human. It was a creature, a part of the mountain, of the ancient force that had consumed him. Meet Tool, thing that had once been Alec smiled, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. Its smile was no longer a mere expression. It was a grotesque, mocking caricature, a thing that mimicked the human face, but lacked any of its warmth, any trace of humanity. "You have come home," the figure said, its voice a deep, rumbling echo of Alec's own. "You were always meant to be here. The mountain has claimed you." Alec could only watch in horror as the figure reached out for him, its hand cold and clammy, fingers long and twisting, like tendrils of shadow reaching for his soul. He tried to pull away, but his body refused to move, held captive by the force of the mountain, the force that had now taken root in him. His mind was a blur, but beneath the panic, beneath the fear, he understood. This wasn't just about the mountain anymore. This was about him, about the part of him that had been consumed by it, that had wanted to be consumed. It wasn't the mountain that had claimed him. It was his own grief, his own guilt, his own darkness that had led him here. The figure's cold fingers brushed his cheek, and the touch was like ice, crawling under his skin, spreading outward from the point of contact. It burned and chilled at the same time, and Alec screamed as the sensation tore through his very bones. "We are one now," the reflection whispered. "We have always been one." The room spun, and Alec could feel the earth shifting beneath his feet. The walls seemed to collapse inward, the space shrinking, compressing around him, as though the cabin itself was being swallowed by the mountain. The heartbeat in the air, his heartbeat, pounded louder, each pulse reverberating through his chest. The rhythm was no longer his own, but the mountain's, the pulse of the earth itself. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming part of something ancient, something vast, something older than the world itself. And then, in the midst of the suffocating darkness, the final, horrifying realization hit him. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that fed on the souls of those who wandered too close to it, too deep into its grasp. It had always been here, always waiting. It didn't just consume the body. It consumed the very essence of a person, their thoughts, their grief, their sins, until they became part of the mountain itself. Alec's vision blurred, and his knees buckled as the figure, the other Alec, took his hand. He could feel himself slipping away, fading, consumed by the dark, by the mountain's insatiable hunger. The last thought that flickered through his mind, cold and heavy, was the memory of Noah, his brother, the brother who had died, the brother whose death had led him here. He had tried to escape the pain, the loss, but now he understood. There was no escape. And then the darkness closed in around him, a swirling, suffocating void, and Alec was no longer Alec. He was part of the mountain, part of the reflection, part of the entity that had consumed him. The last sound he heard was the slow, steady heartbeat of the mountain, and then nothing. The storm outside had long since ceased, the winds now a faint whisper in the distance. The cabin sat empty, its walls creaking with age, the only sound the rhythmic thumping echoing from deep within the earth, the heartbeat of something ancient, something eternal. And somewhere, far below the summit, deep in the bowels of the mountain, Alec's spirit, along with the spirits of countless others, continued to echo, their souls forever bound to the mountain, forever part of its dark and endless pulse. The cabin sat still, frozen in time, as though it had become part of the mountain itself, one of its many hidden secrets buried in the heart of the Cascades. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and decay, the storm that had once raged outside, now a distant memory. The walls creaked softly, groaning with the weight of something unseen, something older than the land itself. The world outside was silent now, shrouded in thick fog that stretched endlessly in every direction, obscuring all that lay beyond. Yet deep within the heart of the cabin, something stirred. It wasn't a noise at first. It was a feeling, a weight in the air, an energy that thrummed through the very wood, vibrating through the floorboards into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to step foot inside. The pulse of the mountain, a heartbeat, steady and insistent, filled the space, filling the cabin with the echo of something far deeper, something far older than the earth itself. And then the whispers began. It was barely audible at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from every corner of the cabin, as if the walls themselves were speaking. It was almost as if the cabin was listening, waiting for something to happen. A flicker of movement caught the corner of the room, where the shadowy figure of Alec's reflection had once stood. It was still there, not a mere spectre, but something else, something that seemed to move with purpose. The air seemed to shift around it, bending to its will, the shadows reaching out from every corner of the room. The figure was not Alec anymore, or at least it wasn't only Alec. It was something else entirely. His body, his soul, had been swallowed by the mountain, but his essence, the part of him that clung to the world he had once known, had not left. It lingered in the reflection, in the twisted shape of what had once been a man, caught between the two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the mountain. Alec, if it could still be called Alec, moved with a sense of purpose, its cold eyes locked onto the journal that sat on the table. The journal that had once been his. It reached out, fingers long and translucent, trembling with a faint, eerie energy as it touched the pages. The pages rustled softly in the stillness, the ink fading in places, the words warped and twisted as if the very act of reading them was a kind of forbidden ritual. "The pulse has begun," it whispered, though its voice was a distorted version of Alec's, hollow and empty, as if it were speaking through a filter of time and space. The words didn't belong to it. They were fragments of memories, fragments of his memories, the things he had once believed, once wanted. The cycle must be completed. The reflection, or the thing that had once been Alec, turned its gaze toward the window. Through the glass, the fog outside had thickened, rolling in like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the world. The mountain, the place that had claimed him, was still here, alive in the mist, alive in the very air. The mountain had never let him go, and now it was calling again. It wasn't a force of nature. It was something more, something alive. The cabin, the land, the very mountain. It had its own consciousness, its own will. And Alec had been chosen, not just as a victim, but as a vessel. The mountain had seen in him the darkness that it craved, his grief, his loneliness, his guilt. They had all fed it, nourished it until it had consumed him, until it had become him. "We are one," the reflection whispered, its voice shaking with a strange, almost reverent tone. "The pulse calls us. We are the mountain now. We are the echoes in the fog." The fog outside thickened, swirling faster, twisting and contorting into shapes that were almost human, almost familiar. Alec, or whatever it was now, looked out into the mist, its expression vacant, yet knowing. It had become something else entirely. It was not Alec, but something that had always been waiting for him, waiting for someone to come and feed it, to give it the attention it had always craved. The mountain and all its many layers of history had been alive long before Alec had ever set foot in its shadow. It had waited for him, for someone like him, someone full of sorrow, someone whose soul could fill the mountain's emptiness. The heartbeat of the mountain grew louder. The pulse throbbed through the floorboards, through the walls, the air itself, and the fog outside seemed to pulse with it, moving as if it were alive, stretching toward the cabin, its tendrils creeping closer, as if the mountain itself was coming, to take what was rightfully its own. But the thing that had been Alec, what had become of him, was not alone. The whispers had begun again, and this time they came not from the air, but from the ground itself. Beneath the floor, beneath the foundation, there was movement. The earth groaned, creaked as if it was shifting, alive with a malevolent energy. The sound of scraping, the dragging of something heavy filled the space, but there was no one to be seen. And then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the floorboards split open. From the gap, a shadow rose, a figure not unlike the one that had once been Alec, but twisted and broken. It was a shape caught between worlds, its form constantly shifting, never fully solid. Its eyes were hollow, black as the void, and its mouth stretched open in an eternal scream. It seemed to be made of the very earth itself, its body pulsing, in time with the heartbeat that filled the cabin. The reflection of Alec turned toward it unblinking, as if it knew what was coming. The figure rose from the earth like a living nightmare, its long skeletal hands reaching toward the other Alec, toward its twin. It was the mountain, feeding on the essence of those who had come and never left. In the moment before the figure could reach out, the room seemed to freeze. The heartbeat, the pulse of the mountain, reached a crescendo, the entire cabin vibrating as though it were alive, its heart beating in time with the pulse of the earth beneath. Alec, the thing that had been Alec, stared at the figure, unblinking, as if recognizing it for the first time. "You've come home too," it whispered. The floor beneath them cracked wide open, and the two figures, one a reflection, the other a twisted manifestation of something once human, moved toward each other. They were two sides of the same coin, trapped in a cycle, bound by the mountain's grip, and as they touched, as the two figures became one, the ground trembled, the walls of the cabin shuddered, and the very air seemed to warp with the energy of their union. The heartbeat of the mountain echoed louder, filling every corner of the room, growing louder and louder, until the air itself vibrated with its force. The cabin began to shake violently, the wood splintering, the walls cracking. The fog outside surged forward, as if the mountain itself was exhaling, sending the mist to claim all that lay within its reach. The shadows in the room began to twist, to stretch, until they became shapes, people, or what had once been people, rising from the ground, emerging from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on Alec's reflection, on the thing that had become him. They were the lost ones, the souls of those who had wandered into the mountain, never to return. And now they were a part of it, a part of the pulse, a part of the mountain. The mountain's will had been done, and Alec, the Alec who had once been, was no longer a man. He had become one with the mountain, one with the pulse, one with the lost echoes of those who had come before. And as the last of the walls collapsed, as the fog swallowed the cabin whole, The pulse of the mountain continued, steady and eternal. And Alec, or what had become of him, whispered one final thought into the dark. We are not alone. The mountain was alive. Alec, if it could still be called Alec, felt the air around him hum, the vibrations deep within the earth thrumming through his bones. The fog outside continued to billow, an ever-expanding blanket that swallowed the world whole, leaving nothing but the empty, oppressive silence of the mountain's heart. The cabin, once a refuge from the elements, now seemed like a distant memory, a fragile thing, crushed beneath the weight of something ancient, something unstoppable. The air inside the cabin was thick with the presence of those who had come. Before, their voices lost to time, their bodies nothing more than fleeting echoes woven into the very fabric of the land. The figure that had once been Alec stood amidst the ruins of the cabin, its form flickering like a half-formed shadow. It moved, its every step sending a ripple through the air, as if it were tethered to something much larger, much older than the fragile husk of the building. It could feel the pulse, the beating heart of the mountain, thrumming within it, synchronizing with its every movement. The lost souls of the mountain were gathered around it now, their hollow eyes staring, unblinking, their forms shifting in and out of existence, as if they were tethered to the very fog that blanketed the earth. They were no longer human. They had become part of the mountain's will, a mass of souls consumed and twisted by the endless hunger of the land. Alec, the creature that had once been Alec, felt it too. The darkness that had once been the shadow of his grief, his guilt, his fear had grown into something unrecognizable. It had expanded, consumed him, and now he was no longer just a man, but a part of the very thing that had claimed him. And yet, there was something else, something lingering in the darkness. A whisper, faint but persistent, threading through his thoughts, pulling at the fragments of memory that had not yet been consumed by the mountain. A name, a voice, Noah. The thought flickered in his mind like a dying ember, but it was enough to pull his attention away from the endless cycle that was now unfolding around him. The weight of the mountain's grip was so suffocating, so absolute, that he couldn't remember how long he had been trapped here. Time had ceased to exist in the pulse of the land, but Noah's name, his brother's face, that had once been real. The fog around him thickened, closing in like a wall, and yet, within that fog, something shifted. There, deep within the haze, Alec could see a shape, a figure, not a shadow, not a spectre, but a person. The outline of a man, his features, barely discernible but unmistakably familiar. It was a figure Alec had seen countless times in his memories, but it couldn't be. It couldn't be real. Noah, Alec whispered, the name foreign on his tongue. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate, as though it were emerging from a distant dream. The fog parted slightly around him, revealing a young man, a boy really, standing in the center of the cabin, his eyes locked onto Alec's. His features were sharp, pale, his dark hair matted against his forehead. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn the last time Alec had seen him, before the accident, before everything had changed. Noah, how are you here? Alec's voice cracked, disbelief flooding his chest. You... But Noah didn't speak. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes wide, with an expression Alec could not place, something between sadness and regret, something that Alec hadn't seen in years. He stopped just in front of Alec, his eyes never leaving his brother's face, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Alec reached out instinctively, his hand trembling. But as his fingers brushed the air before him, Noah's form began to flicker, like the image of a mirage in the heat. His features twisted and warped for a brief moment, becoming an indistinct blur, before solidifying again, this time different. His eyes were no longer human, but hollow, black as the void. Alec's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the mountain. He reached again, his fingers brushing the fading form, but Noah's image flickered again, this time disappearing entirely, dissolving into the fog that still coiled around them. "Noah!" Alec cried, his voice raw, the pain of loss cutting deep into his chest. The cabin seemed to breathe around him, and for the first time, the suffocating weight of the mountain's grip loosened ever so slightly. The heartbeat of the land slowed, fading to a distant thrum. And then, the whispers that had surrounded him since his arrival, the whispers that were part of the mountain itself, grew louder, more insistent. "You are not him." The voice was cold, harsh, a low growl reverberating through the air. "He is gone." The words struck Alec like a physical blow. The memory of Noah's face, of his brother, was fading now, slipping away like a dying star. Alec stumbled backward, falling against the broken remnants of the cabin's walls. His mind reeled, the echoes of his grief pulling him deeper into the mountain's grasp. "You're not real," Alec whispered through clenched teeth. "You can't be real. This isn't real." The fog closed in around him, swallowing the last remnants of the vision, leaving only the cold, oppressive silence. The fog, the pulse, the voices, they were all part of it, part of the mountain, part of the endless cycle that had ensnared him. And then through the fog, Alec heard a voice, his own voice, but twisted and distorted, echoing through the cabin. It spoke from the shadows, from the dark recesses of the earth itself. "You are lost. You are part of this place now. There is no escaping. There is no freedom." Alec's mind teetered on the edge of madness. The voice was his, but it was not. It was the mountain speaking through him, speaking to him, showing him the truth that had always been there. His grief, his guilt, his loss. They had all fed it, nourished it, made him one with it. The mountain had always claimed those who wandered too deep into its heart, and Alec had been no different. He had sought refuge, but what he had found was a prison, a place where the past, the present, and the future bled into one, a place where nothing ever truly died, but lived on in endless echoes. The people who had come before him, the lost souls trapped within the mountain's grip, were no different. They were all part of the land now, part of the pulse. And so was he. Alec's body convulsed as the weight of the realization settled over him. He had never truly been free. He had been running from himself, from his pain, from his grief. But now that grief had claimed him. He was no longer a man. He was part of the land, part of the pulse, part of the eternal cycle that fed on the souls of the lost. And in that final moment when Alec's body was consumed by the mountain's hunger, his last thought was not of escape. It was not of freedom. It was simply this: we are all echoes, lost in the pulse, forever. And the mountain's heartbeat continued, steady and unbroken, as the fog rose to claim the last remnants of the cabin. The mountain had swallowed him whole. Alec, what remained of Alec, lay suspended in the fog, the pulse of the earth thrumming through his body, reverberating in his bones. He was no longer a man, not in the sense he once understood. His body, his mind, his very soul had been absorbed into the vast, eternal hunger of the land. The mist, the fog, the whispers, they were now his world, and the pulse of the mountain was the heartbeat that kept him alive. The fog around him was suffocating, thick and heavy, rolling in from the very depths of the earth. It clung to him, to every part of him, sinking into his skin like a second layer. He could no longer feel the distinction between his body and the mountain itself. It was as if the boundaries between the two had blurred, his essence mingling with the land, a silent surrender to the inevitable. The air was thick with a hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from every direction, but it was more than just sound. It was a sensation, a presence, filling the space around him, pressing into his thoughts, his soul. And through the fog, there were shapes. Shapes that moved, flickered, danced in the mist. They were figures, humanoid, ghostly, but they were not alive. They were echoes like him, trapped in the mountain's grasp. They moved like shadows, their forms flickering in and out of existence, never fully solid. The lost souls who had wandered into the mountain, only to be consumed by its hunger, were now part of it, part of the land's eternal cycle. Alec could feel them around him, could hear their thoughts, their fragmented memories. They were not speaking, not in any way that could be understood with language. It was more like the collective hum of despair, a chorus of voices lost to time, their minds consumed by the mountain's insatiable pull. He could feel their confusion, their rage, their sadness all mingling in the fog, but he no longer had the ability to differentiate between his own thoughts and theirs. He was part of the collective now, part of the land's endless echo. There was no difference between him and the souls that had come before. The fog began to thicken, pressing in on him, suffocating him. Alec tried to move, tried to push against it, but his limbs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. He had no strength left, no will of his own. He was no longer an individual, no longer a separate being. The pulse of the mountain had taken him, and there was nothing left but the emptiness that came with surrender. In that silence, that suffocating stillness, he heard it again. A voice, faint but distinct, rising from the depths of the fog. A name. Noah. The name cut through the fog like a knife, a shard of clarity amidst the endless swirling confusion. Alec's mind, if it could still be called his own, grasped at the name, at the thought of his brother, the only part of his past that had ever felt real. Noah, his brother who had been taken from him, who had been lost in the same way Alec was, now. His grief, his guilt, his endless sorrow, all of it had led him here, to this place, to this moment of complete and utter surrender. The name lingered in the air like a ghost, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Alec could feel something. A flicker of warmth, a spark of life perhaps, but it was fleeting, like a memory fading just as it was about to be remembered. He reached out toward it, but the fog swallowed it whole. The mist began to shift again. The figures around him, those souls who had once been human, seemed to stir. They moved closer, their forms flickering more vividly, their presence growing more pronounced. Alec could sense their despair, their eternal hunger, their need to escape. But there was no escaping this place. There was no escape from the pulse of the mountain, from the endless echo that reverberated through time. Alec could feel their collective anguish, their silent cries for release, and for the first time since his arrival, he understood. They were all connected now, bound to the mountain, bound to its endless hunger. The mountain was not merely a physical place. It was a prison for their souls, a place where time had no meaning, and death was only the beginning of a new, eternal cycle. The fog pressed closer, more suffocating now. Alec's body, his soul, everything, was being pulled into the earth itself. He could feel the ground beneath him begin to shift, to swallow him whole. The boundaries between the land and his spirit were dissolving. There was no longer any distinction between him and the mountain. He had become part of it. And then, as his consciousness began to fade, as his thoughts melted into the fog, a final realization struck him. The mountain had not just taken his body. It had taken his soul. It had taken all of him. He was no longer Alec. He was the mountain. He was the pulse. He was the echo that would forever reverberate through the land, the shadow that would never fade, the voice that would always whisper, in the fog. He was one with the land's hunger, with its endless cycle of consumption and rebirth. He was not a person anymore. He was part of something much older, much more terrifying. He was part of the thing that had called to him from the beginning, the thing that had always been there, waiting for someone to answer. The fog closed in on him, the pulse growing louder, the heartbeat echoing in his chest. He could no longer fight it. He could no longer hold on to the memories of his past, to his brother, to the life he had once known. All of it was fading, dissolving into the emptiness of the mountain. And as the fog swallowed him whole, Alec's final thought was not one of regret. It wasn't even a thought at all. It was simply an understanding, a knowing that he had become what he had always feared. He had become one of the lost souls, the ones who had wandered into the mountain's embrace, only to be consumed by its endless hunger. He had become an echo, a part of the pulse, and there was no escape. The fog seemed to stretch out forever, endless and suffocating. Alec, if it could still be called Alec, drifted in the oppressive mist, no longer a man, but a whisper, an echo, lost in the eternal pulse of the mountain. The very essence of the land had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only the faintest traces of his humanity. His body had faded into the shadows, his soul merged with the darkness that breathed beneath the surface of the earth. Yet somewhere deep within, a spark of something remained, a shard of memory, a flicker of life that refused to be consumed entirely. The mountain, for all its hunger, had not yet claimed everything. The pulse, while steady and relentless, was not all-encompassing. There was still a sliver of hope, a faint echo of a life that had once been. Alec's consciousness, what was left of it, clung to that fading memory, to the man he had been, to the brother he had lost. For a moment, everything was still. The fog swirled around him, thick and suffocating. But there was something else now, something strange. A hum, a distant vibration, rising from beneath the mountain, deep within the very earth itself. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat buried in the stone. But it grew louder, stronger, until it was a roar, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the very core of the land. The pulse of the mountain was slowing. Alec, whatever was left of him, could feel it. The earth beneath him seemed to tremble, as if the mountain itself was in pain. The fog around him began to twist and writhe, like something was trying to push its way through, something that didn't belong to the land, something that had been trapped within it. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy, thick and electric, the very atmosphere alive with an impending change. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice pierced through the fog. A voice that was familiar, though distant. A voice that sent a shock of recognition through the empty, hollow space in Alec's mind. Alec. It was the same name, the same voice he had heard so many times before. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the voice of the mountain, nor the reflection that had once been him. It was something else. Something that resonated with the faintest traces of the man Alec had been. Noah. Alec's voice, if it could still be called a voice, whispered the name into the fog, the words lost in the endless mist that clung to him like a second skin. The fog around him began to shift, as if responding to the sound of his brother's name. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight of the land lightening ever so slightly, and for the first time since he had entered the mountain, Alec felt something he had not felt in what felt like an eternity. hope. The voice continued, though faint, its edges jagged and broken, as if the very act of speaking were painful. "You can still hear me. You're still here." Alec's consciousness flickered, something inside him reaching toward the voice. He remembered Noah, his brother, his family, and the life that had once been his. But the memory was a fragile thing, slipping away like water through his fingers. The fog fought to erase it, to pull him back into the pulse of the mountain, to consume him entirely. But the voice, Noah's voice, grew louder, closer, stronger. "You can find your way back. It's not too late. You're not lost yet." Alec's fragmented mind struggled to comprehend the words. The mountain, for all its power, for all its eternal hunger, could not completely erase the bond between them. The memories of his brother, memories of laughter, of warmth, of moments long gone, began to surface, rising through the fog, fighting against the darkness that had consumed him. The pulse of the mountain was still there, beating in his chest, but it no longer felt like a part of him. It felt foreign. For the first time, Alec realized that he could resist. His heart, what remained of it, thudded against the suffocating silence of the mountain, beating in time with Noah's voice. His thoughts, though fractured, began to gather. Strength, the fog, the endless cycle of despair, the pull of the land. It could not hold him forever. The pulse of the mountain slowed once more, as if reacting to his resistance, faltering under the weight of something new. The mist around him began to dissolve, retreating back into the earth, slowly giving way to something else, something brighter, something warmer. The oppressive presence that had haunted him for so long was fading, slowly unraveling. Alec's breath, if he could still call it breathing, grew steadier. He could feel the presence of the mountain weakening, its grip loosening as he reached for the voice that called to him, the voice that had not abandoned him even in the darkest depths of the earth. "You're not alone, Alec. You never were." The fog was almost gone now, dissipating like smoke in the wind. The pulse, the heartbeat of the mountain, grew quieter, weaker, as if something was taking it away. Alec reached out, his mind grasping toward that sliver of hope, that last flicker of connection to the world he had lost. He could feel himself pulling free from the mountain's hold, from the suffocating fog, from the endless cycle of shadows that had kept him bound. And then, just as the last remnants of the fog were swallowed by the light, Alec felt a sudden shift, a break. His body, once heavy and unfeeling, seemed to surge with energy, as if he were being drawn upward, pulled free from the depths that had kept him imprisoned. The world around him blurred and flickered, and for a brief moment he could see it. The summit, the sky, the land stretching out before him. Freedom. His heart beat louder now, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was no longer the mountain's, but his own. Alec's breath came in heavy gasps, his mind clearing, the fog lifting from his consciousness. The feeling of the earth beneath him, the pulse of the mountain, had faded into the distance, and what remained was not the hunger, not the endless cycle, but the possibility of something more. Alec. Noah's voice again, so close now, like a whisper in his ear, and with that final call, Alec's world came crashing back to him. He blinked, and the fog was gone. The cold, oppressive weight of the mountain had lifted, and he was standing once again, not in the cabin, but on a familiar path. The North Cascades stretched out before him, the snow-capped peaks rising against the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Alec was free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was no longer bound by the pulse of the mountain. He could feel the wind on his face, the warmth of the sun on his skin, and for the first time there was no fog, there were no shadows, no whispers, just silence. But as he took a step forward, he couldn't help but glance back. He could feel it, the mountain, still there, still waiting, still watching. It would always be there, just beneath the surface. A part of him, a part of the land, a part of the pulse. Alec wasn't truly free, but he had survived, and for now, that was enough. The wind was the first thing Alec felt as he stepped away from the precipice of the mountain, its cool fingers brushing against his skin as if urging him forward. The air was crisp, clean, a far cry from the suffocating fog that had once bound him, the crushing weight of the mountain that had nearly consumed him entirely. But despite the clear skies, despite the warmth of the sun beginning to rise over the jagged peaks of the North Cascades, Alec couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something still clung to him, something from the depths of the mountain that hadn't quite let go. He glanced over his shoulder, the familiar sight of the cabin now barely visible, hidden in the mist that lingered at the foot of the mountain. It looked like any other forgotten place, abandoned, lost to the world. But Alec knew better. That cabin, the place that had almost claimed him, still existed in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a physical structure. It was something deeper, something tied to the very fabric of the mountain itself. It was a nexus, a place where the boundary between the living and the lost blurred, a place where the echoes of the past still lingered. The sound of the wind howling through the trees brought him back to the present, but the unease that clung to him remained. He had walked away from the mountain, but he wasn't sure if the mountain had truly walked away from him. Alec continued down the winding path, his footsteps light, though his mind felt heavy. The world was beautiful here, breathtaking in its solitude. The North Cascades stretched endlessly in every direction, their snow-covered peaks reflecting the first light of dawn. The tranquility was a balm to his broken soul. He should have felt free, but the nagging feeling in his chest, like something was watching him, waiting for him, refused to be silenced. He paused, breathing in the cold, pine-scented air, trying to calm the rising anxiety. He had made it out. He had escaped the grip of the mountain, the endless cycle of darkness that had nearly consumed him. But there was something unfinished. The memories of Noah, the voice, the presence, the faintest trace of his brother's memory that had once been so real, still lingered. It felt like a puzzle with pieces missing, like the world was out of focus, slightly warped, as if the mountain had shifted the very lens through which he viewed reality. His hand instinctively reached up to touch the scar that marked his neck, the mark from when he had first encountered the reflection, when he had first realized that something had taken root in him, something that had become part of his very being. The scar was faint now, hardly visible, but he could still feel it, like an imprint, a trace of what he had been, like a whisper of something that had never truly left. A rustling sound broke through his thoughts, a faint crack of branches underfoot. Alec's head snapped to the side, his body tensed, his heart skipping a beat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there it was, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, hesitant, coming from behind him. He wasn't alone. Alec turned, his eyes scanning the forest. The path behind him stretched in both directions, winding around the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. But there was no one in sight. Only the shadows cast by the tall pines, the shifting light of the morning sun, and the stillness of the mountain. His pulse quickened. He felt a presence. Something was there. It was then that he noticed it. The faintest trace of fog, creeping along the forest floor like a serpent, curling its way toward him from the shadows. He hadn't seen fog in days, not since the moment he'd escaped the mountain's grasp. And yet here it was, winding its way up the path, thick and suffocating, crawling over the dirt like a living thing. Alec stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. His body was frozen, but his mind raced. He had left the mountain. He had broken free of its hold. But the fog, The pulse, it was returning. The mountain was not done with him. It wasn't finished. The mist seemed to coil tighter, pressing in on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the familiar weight of the fog wrapping around him, filling his mind with the whispers of those who had been lost. The voices, faint but insistent, began to rise from the depths of the mist, murmuring his name, calling to him. Alec. The voice, once so distant, now sounded right behind him, close enough to make his skin prickle. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the clearing, but there was nothing. No one. Just the trees, the wind, the fog. But the voice came again. This time louder, sharper, filled with a chilling certainty. Alec, you can't escape. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a shroud, obscuring his vision, pulling him deeper into the mountain's grip. He reached out, his hands trembling, but the fog closed in around him, suffocating him, erasing all the light. The voices swirled louder now, the whispers rising to a crescendo. They were everywhere, in his ears, in his mind, in his very soul. It was the mountain, alive inside him. The figure appeared then, emerging from the fog like a shadow, flickering in and out of sight, its form distorted and broken. Alec knew it immediately. It was the reflection, the thing that had once been him, the twisted image that had haunted him, the other Alec that had tried to consume him. The creature, no, the echo, stared at him with cold, hollow eyes, its grin stretching unnaturally wide. You can't escape, it whispered, its voice warped, drenched in a mocking, mournful tone. Not really, not for long. Alec staggered back, his breath hitching in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his legs were frozen in place, locked to the earth beneath him. The shadow moved closer, its form becoming more defined, more real. Its presence, though no longer physically bound to the mountain, was still there. It still lingered inside him. The mountain was not done with him. It was then that Alec realized the mountain's pull, its influence, its hunger. It wasn't just the land. It was him. It had consumed him, yes, but in doing so, it had made him part of it. A part of the pulse, a part of the cycle that fed on lost souls and endless regrets. You're not free, Alec, the reflection murmured, its grin widening. Not truly. The mountain will never let go. Alec's heart raced as the fog thickened around him, but he felt it now. His connection to the land, to the pulse, it was alive within him. The struggle, the escape, had never been about the mountain. It had been about him, his grief, his guilt, the part of him that had never truly left, that had always been drawn to the land, to the hunger. And then for a moment, there was clarity. In that brief instant, Alec understood. The mountain, the fog, the pulse. It wasn't just a place. It was a part of him. A part of everyone who had ever come to this land, searching for peace, for solace. It had fed on them, consumed them, and in doing so, it had become them. And Alec, he had become a part of it. He had never truly escaped. The reflection's face twisted in a cruel, mocking smile. It's inside you, Alec, it whispered, and it always will be. The fog enveloped him completely, the whispers growing louder, the pulse intensifying. Alec's body trembled as the last remnants of the light were swallowed by the mist. The last breath of freedom slipped through his fingers, and he was pulled back, deeper into the fog, deeper into the mountain's hunger. The cycle was never truly broken, and Alec, once again, was lost. Alec's senses were consumed by the pulse, an endless thrumming that filled the air around him, reverberating through his entire being. He had once believed he had escaped it, the endless hunger of the mountain, the suffocating grip of the fog. But now, deep within the mist, he understood the horrifying truth. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The fog pressed against him from all sides, heavy and thick like a living thing, wrapping around him like chains, drawing him deeper into the heart of the mountain. He could hear the whispers again, those same voices fainted. First, but growing louder, rising from the depths of the mist. They were the lost souls, trapped in the eternal cycle, their voices filling his mind with their cries, their regrets, their broken memories. Alec. The voice was soft at first, but then it grew louder, filled with anguish and despair. Alec's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes searching the fog. There, just beyond his reach, a figure materialized, a silhouette, fading in and out of sight like a wisp of smoke. His heart pounded in his chest, the familiar feeling of dread creeping into his bones. It wasn't the reflection this time. It wasn't the twisted version of himself. No, this voice, this figure, it was someone else. Alec's breath caught in his throat. The figure stepped closer, and as the fog parted, Alec could see who it was. Noah. The figure was unmistakable now. It was his brother Noah, his face pale, eyes wide with an emotion Alec couldn't quite place. The sight of him, so real, so close, made Alec's chest tighten. The guilt, the grief, the memories of Noah's death, everything he had tried to escape came crashing down on him in that instant. Noah, Alec whispered, the word breaking apart in his throat. How are you here? Noah's image flickered as if it were unstable, a mirage formed from the very fog. His face was not entirely human. It was distorted, his features stretched and bent, the light in his eyes hollowed out. But it was still him. Still the brother Alec had lost, the one whose death had haunted him, whose absence had torn at his soul. I'm not real, Noah's voice whispered, faint but insistent. It sounded like a cry from a distant place, torn by grief. Not anymore. Not in the way you remember. Alec's hand reached toward him, trembling, as if afraid to touch the figure in front of him. What? What are you saying? I'm part of the mountain now, Alec, Noah's image said, his voice trembling with something Alec couldn't quite understand. I'm part of what you've become, part of the cycle. I'm lost, like the others. We are all part of it. The words hit Alec like a slap. His mind spun, his chest tightening with an overwhelming mixture of grief and confusion. No, you can't be. You're my brother. Noah's form flickered again, more pronounced this time, his body warping and twisting as if it couldn't maintain its shape. I was never supposed to die, Alec, he said, his voice a broken echo. But the mountain claimed me. It takes what it wants. And now you're part of it too. You can't escape, Alec. Not from me. Not from this. Alec's heart pounded. In his chest, the weight of those words suffocating him. He had thought he was free. He had thought the mountain had released him. But the fog, the pulse, the whispers, everything pointed to the truth he had been avoiding. He hadn't escaped. The mountain wasn't a place, it was a cycle. It had claimed him, it had claimed Noah, and it would claim anyone who wandered too. Far into its grasp, he had become a part of it, and Noah too had become one with the land, a part of the pulse, a part of the endless hunger. Noah... No, I can't, Alec stammered, the words failing him. He wanted to scream, to run, but the fog pressed against him, holding him in place, preventing him from moving, from leaving this place. His body felt heavy, like it had been carved from stone, the mountain's weight crushing down on him. His mind felt split, half of him still fought, still longed to break free, while the other half seemed to accept the truth of it. A voice broke through his thoughts, a whisper that seemed to surround him, to wrap around him like a thread pulling him into the depths. You can't escape, Alec. You never will. Alec's eyes darted to the side, where the reflection, the twisted version of himself, stood once again, its form flickering in the fog, its eyes cold and hollow, its grin sharp and mocking. "It's a part of you now," the reflection hissed, its voice slithering through the mist. "You are the mountain. The mountain is you. The pulse, the hunger. You will never be free. You are one of us now." "No," Alec whispered, shaking his head violently. "No, I'm not. I'm not like you." The reflection's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, its smile widening impossibly. "You already are, Alec. You've always been. And now you will never leave. You will never escape the cycle. You will be the mountain's pulse, its echo, forever." Alec's heart thundered in his chest as the mountain's voice grew louder, the fog wrapping tighter around him, the weight of the land pressing into his soul. The fog seemed to pulse with life, thrumming with the power of something ancient, something eternal. "Noah," Alec pleaded, his voice a strained whisper. "Help me. Please. I can't." Noah's figure flickered once more, a faint, mournful light shining in his eyes. But the light quickly faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness. "I can't help you, Alec." His voice was filled with sorrow, the words breaking like fragile glass. "You're part of this now. You've always been. The mountain calls you, just like it called me. And now you can never leave." Tears welled in Alec's eyes, and his chest constricted with an unbearable grief. His brother, his family, was gone, taken by the mountain. And now Alec, too, would be consumed by it, swallowed by the very thing that had claimed so many before, and him. But even as the fog thickened, as the mountain's pulse grew stronger, Alec felt a flicker. A tiny spark, deep inside him, a spark of resistance, a spark of something that still refused to be completely consumed. In that moment, Alec realized the true horror of the mountain. It was not just a place, it was an idea, an eternal hunger that fed not on the body, but on the soul. It was a cycle that never ended, a never-ending loop of grief and regret, a pull that trapped all those who ventured too deep into its grasp. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, Alec understood that he had become part of that cycle. His brother was lost to it. He too was lost to it. And yet in that loss, something remained. Something flickered within him, something that whispered a truth even the mountain could not silence. It is never over. As the fog closed in, as the mountain's grip tightened around his chest, Alec's last thought was not one of defeat. It was not one of surrender. It was the realization that no matter how far the mountain stretched, no matter how deep the fog, there would always be someone who would resist. And that resistance would echo always through the pulse. The fog was thick now, suffocating, a prison that held Alec's body and soul in a vice-like grip. It surrounded him, cocooned him in its unyielding, oppressive embrace, every breath a battle against the weight of its existence. The pulse of the mountain, the heartbeat of the earth itself, was deafening, thumping through his very bones, resonating in every fiber of his being. Alec felt as though his mind was splitting, torn between the weight of his memories, the presence of his brother, and the unrelenting pull of the land. The reflection stood before him, its twisted form flickering like a flame caught in a storm. Its grin stretched wider, almost mocking, a grotesque distortion of Alec's own face. Its hollow eyes were black, voids that seemed to consume all the light around them. But Alec no longer feared it. He no longer feared the pulse, the fog, or even the mountain itself. What remained in his chest, a small stubborn ember, refused to be consumed by the hunger. It refused to be lost to the endless cycle. "You'll never escape," the reflection whispered, its voice a venomous hiss curling into Alec's mind. You are part of the mountain now, Alec. There is no freedom, no peace. There is only the pulse, the hunger. The reflection's form flickered again, but this time Alec didn't flinch. He had faced it, felt it, and he now understood. This creature, this twisted version of himself, was not a separate entity. It was him, a manifestation of his own fear, guilt and grief, of all the things he had buried deep within himself, things he had never allowed to surface. It was the mountain's way of claiming him, of making him part of its eternal, suffocating cycle. But Alec had learned something in those final moments before the fog closed in, before the mountain's pulse had almost swallowed him whole. It was something the mountain had never wanted him to understand. Alec's mind had been split, torn between the need to resist and the overwhelming weight of the land's hunger. But he now knew what the mountain had tried to erase. The truth, buried deep within its very soil. He wasn't alone. Noah. Alec whispered the name again, his voice hoarse, but filled with something stronger now. A flicker of resolve. I'm not alone. I never was. The mist stirred, swirling around him in thick, ethereal tendrils. For a moment, the fog receded, just enough for Alec to see beyond it. The shapes of the lost souls, the echoes of the mountain's previous victims flickered and shifted in the distance. He could feel their presence. They were not his enemies. They were not the mountain's slaves. They were the forgotten. Alec's eyes locked onto the image of Noah once more, the figure of his brother standing just beyond the fog. But Noah was no longer the distorted, hollow shell of a memory. He was there, alive, real. The grief that had once crushed Alec now transformed into something else, something like understanding, like peace. Noah's form flickered and stabilized, and his voice cut through the mist, clear and strong this time. You've always been stronger than you believed, Noah said, his voice no longer the faint, distorted echo it had once been. It was full of warmth, full of life. The mountain feeds on fear, on grief, on the parts of us that we try to bury. But it can't take everything, Alec. Not as long as you remember. The fog began to dissipate, retreating from Alec's mind, from his body. The pulse of the mountain, the steady thrum that had once defined his existence, began to fade. It didn't disappear completely, but it lost its grip. Alec could feel it, a faint pulse beneath the earth, but distant now, no longer the overwhelming force that it had been. Noah, Alec whispered, his voice cracking. You were never gone. Noah's form moved closer, his face softened with the same knowing smile that Alec had remembered. But now there was something more, something alive in the air around them. The fog, the pulse, everything that had tried to consume him had begun to unravel. You carried me with you, Noah said, his voice filled with understanding. You always carried me. And now you can let go of the pain, the guilt. You fought, Alec. And now you'll find peace. The last of the fog evaporated, the weight lifting from Alec's shoulders as the pulse slowed, then stopped altogether. The suffocating pressure that had kept him bound to the mountain for so long began to fade. The land still hummed beneath, him still alive, but it no longer held him in its grasp. Alec stood, his eyes locked on his brother's form. The pull of the mountain, the fear of being consumed, was gone. The fog had retreated, leaving nothing but the quiet stillness of the land behind. And for the first time, Alec felt like he had the strength to leave it behind. But the mountain, the land, was still there. It was still alive, still a presence, still part of him, part of them. It would always remain. There was no escaping the past, no running from the pain, the grief, the loss. But there was something else now, a space for healing, a space to breathe. Alec could feel the land, its eternal heartbeat, and he understood that the mountain's hunger wasn't just about consuming, it was about change, about becoming a part of something greater. And while Alec would never truly be free of the land's grip, he could move forward, carrying with him the memories of the lost, the ones who had come before. The cycle, though endless, could be understood, even respected. "I won't forget you, Noah," Alec said softly, his voice steady now. "I won't forget any of it." The figure of Noah smiled, his form beginning to fade, the last remnants of his presence slipping away into the fog, merging with the land once more. But this time it wasn't a loss. It was a connection, an eternal bond, one that could never truly be severed. "Remember who you are," Noah's voice echoed one last time, before he disappeared completely, leaving Alec standing alone, but not truly isolated. The mountain was still there, but Alec had reclaimed himself, his identity, his strength. The last remnants of the fog parted, the sun now breaking through the clouds, bathing the land in a soft golden light. The path before Alec was clear. The mountain had not defeated him. He had learned from it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. With one last glance toward the misty peaks of the North Cascades, Alec took his first step away from the fog, away from the pulse, away from the endless cycle, and toward a future that was, for once, his own. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The trail had always seemed longer than they remembered, winding its way through the dense forest and up into the rugged embrace of the Absaroka Mountains. Montana's wild beauty sprawled beneath a sky so open it felt like the edge of the world. But today, something about the air was different. Thick clouds hung heavily overhead, their darkness not quite right. It wasn't just the weather that unsettled Sarah, but the quiet. There had been no birds calling, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. The forest felt unnaturally still. Sarah glanced at Jake as they trudged onward, the rhythm of their boots crunching against the frozen earth the only sound. He looked unbothered, eyes fixed ahead, his beanie pulled low over his brow. She envied his calm, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they were being watched, the kind of feeling that makes your skin prickle and your pulse quicken for no reason you can place. "You sure about this hike?" she asked, her voice strained as she tried to brush off the growing anxiety tightening in her chest. Jake gave a lazy grin, not looking back. "Of course, we've hiked worse conditions than this. A little snow won't stop us." He was right in a way. They had hiked these trails many times before, always seeking the quiet escape that the mountains offered. But this was different. The storm was rolling in faster than expected, and the air was growing colder, heavy with the anticipation of something unpleasant. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself and quickened her pace, trying to ignore the gnawing sensation that the mountain had started to close in around them. As they crested the ridge, the world below them disappeared into a veil of white. Snowflakes, small at first, began to fall in a steady, thickening curtain. The wind picked up, making the world feel smaller, its reach infinite. It was a sudden change, the temperature dropping, the visibility fading, the light dimming as the snow thickened with a cruel speed. "This is getting bad fast," Sarah said, her voice rising with the wind. Jake stopped in his tracks, looking over the sheer drop to the valley below. He checked his watch, his brows furrowing as the snow intensified. The air was filled with the sound of the wind picking up, howling and wailing as if trying to tear them from the ridge. "Let's find shelter." There's a cliff just ahead, a little ways off. They stumbled forward, snow swirling around their faces, cutting through their clothes like knives. It wasn't just the cold. The storm seemed alive, as though it could reach into their very thoughts. Their breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the air around them as they trudged toward the overhang. The jagged rocks seemed to rise out of the snow like sentinels, dark and foreboding against the white backdrop of the storm. They reached the overhang just as the storm hit in full force. The snow was so thick now that they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. Sarah felt a rush of relief when they took shelter under the overhanging cliff. The rock smelled of damp earth and moss. The cold seeped in quickly, but it was better than being exposed to the fury outside. Jake dropped his pack and leaned against the wall, brushing the snow from his jacket. He cast a glance at Sarah, his lips pulled into a tight smile. This will blow over soon. Sarah wasn't so sure. She pulled her legs in close to her chest, trying to stave off the bone-deep chill that had settled in her joints. The storm raged around them, the wind a deafening roar. It felt as though the entire world had closed in, the snow and wind pressing against the rock like a living thing. There was something unnatural about the storm, something malevolent in its rush and fury, as if it was pushing them deeper into the heart of the mountain. Jake sat down beside her, his breathing steady, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "You know, I'm not sure this is just a regular storm," he said, the hint of a nervous laugh in his voice. "Something about it feels off." Sarah nodded, tightening her grip on her jacket. "I was just thinking the same thing." They sat in silence, the storm outside drowning out everything but the howl of the wind. The world beyond the cliff was gone, just a blank canvas of white. It was as though time had stopped. But then, from somewhere beyond the storm's roar, a strange sound reached their ears. A voice, not loud, but distinct enough to break the silence that had settled between them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice trembled as she leaned closer to Jake, her eyes scanning the space beyond their shelter. Jake's gaze darted to the horizon. "It's just the wind. Maybe an animal, or—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp now. "That was a voice. A person's voice." Jake frowned, then stood up, his face set in a determined line. He took a few steps toward the edge of the cliff, his eyes straining to see through the whiteout. "I'm sure it was just the wind. But we're not alone out here," Jake said, glancing back over his shoulder. "There's probably some other hikers taking shelter nearby." He took another step, looking down at the empty, snow-covered valley below. The wind tugged at his jacket, the air icy and biting, but there was no sound, no movement, just the vast emptiness. "That was no animal," Sarah whispered, a chill creeping down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She wasn't sure why, but the thought of a stranger out here, in this storm, unsettled her deeply. She could feel her heart racing now, a prickle of unease spreading through her chest. Jake turned back toward her, about to speak, when his words were cut off by a sudden sharp crack in the air. A voice, louder this time. "Is anyone out there?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Jake blinked, then laughed nervously. "It's just the storm, Sarah. The echo off the rocks or something." But Sarah didn't hear him. The voice had come from somewhere behind them, deeper in the mountains, unmistakably clear despite the howling wind. She was sure of it now. It wasn't the wind. Something else was out there, and it was calling. The silence that followed the strange voice seemed to stretch on forever. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she had imagined it, if it was just her mind playing tricks in the cold, her senses dulled by the relentless blizzard. But the chill crawling up her spine, the heavy weight of her thoughts, told her otherwise. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jake had heard it too. She could see it in the way he stood, frozen, his body tensed and rigid, his hand still resting on the edge of the rocky outcrop as he stared into the storm, his breath coming faster now. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible against the howling wind. She reached out and touched his shoulder, and he flinched, as though pulled out of a trance. He turned to her, his eyes wide, the nervous grin that usually played across his face now absent. "You heard that too, didn't you?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "It wasn't the wind, Jake. That wasn't just an echo." Jake swallowed hard. "What do you think it was?" She didn't know what to say. The idea that someone else could be out there in the storm, someone or something, felt both impossible and terrifying. The storm was too strong for anyone to be out there, not this far from the nearest trail. But the voice, clear and almost purposeful, had shattered the illusion of safety they'd been clinging to. The isolation of the mountains, once a comfort, now felt suffocating. Another gust of wind tore through the shelter, rattling the overhang. Snow began to swirl around them in vicious whirls, biting their exposed skin. Sarah wrapped her arms around her body, her mind racing. Was someone playing a cruel prank? Had another group of hikers wandered too far off course? Or was it something else entirely? The voice came again, unmistakable this time, rising above the wind with an eerie clarity. "I see you." The words echoed across the space, not just in the air but in her mind, ringing with a strange weight, heavy and dark. It wasn't an echo of their words, it was an answer, a response. But there was something unsettlingly deliberate about it, almost as if it had been waiting for them, waiting for this moment. The air around them seemed to thicken with tension, pressing in on Sarah's chest. She couldn't breathe right. The cold that had been biting before now felt like it was seeping into her bones, settling deep within her. The storm outside no longer seemed like just a natural occurrence. It had become something else, alive, a presence. Jake turned to her with wide eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. Did it just say that?" Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her ears, drowning out the howling wind. "It's not the storm. It's something else." For a long, dreadful moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside their shelter had become a maddening blur of white, the wind howling with an intensity that seemed impossible, rattling the very rocks they were huddled beneath. The storm was growing worse by the minute. The temperature had dropped even further, and Sarah could feel her fingers and toes going numb. "Maybe we should head back," Jake said, his voice strained. "Get out of here before it gets worse." Sarah could only nod. She wasn't sure she believed in ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural, but there was no denying what they were hearing. This storm wasn't just a storm. It was something else. Something dark, ancient even. But as they stood, preparing to gather their things and leave, another voice echoed, clearer this time, carrying a sense of familiarity. "I see you." Sarah's blood ran cold. That was not the voice from before. This was different. A man's voice, but low, gravelly, older, with a deliberate resonance that sent chills crawling up her spine. Jake's hand shot out, gripping her arm tightly. His face was pale, his eyes wide in shock. What the hell is that? It didn't make sense. The storm was fierce, the wind a constant roar, but this voice, this deep, gravelly voice, sounded close. Too close. It didn't come from the wind. It didn't come from any direction that made sense. And then, without warning, the ground trembled beneath them. A subtle vibration that seemed to hum through the rock. Sarah's eyes snapped to the ground, and she realized in horror that the vibration was not just the earth shaking. It was something else, something moving beneath their feet. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it an animal? Some large creature beneath the rock, shifting in its lair? But no sound of claws or fur moved against the stone. No scraping, no rustling. Only that voice. A voice that had no origin. "I see you," it repeated, and this time it was followed by a low, almost guttural laugh, as if the very wind itself was mocking them. Sarah staggered back, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel her breath coming faster now, panic creeping up her spine like a cold hand. What is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. She couldn't answer. She had no idea. The ground beneath them rumbled again, more violently. This time, and suddenly, the shadows of the overhang seemed to twist and shift. A fleeting movement in the corner of her eye, a flash of something dark, impossibly black against the snow. Sarah spun toward it, but there was nothing there. "Jake, she started, but her words faltered in the dense, eerie silence that followed. It felt as though the storm had momentarily paused, holding its breath. The voice came again, this time from above, rumbling from the rocks themselves. "I see you, both of you." The words were clear, and they were no longer an echo. They were coming from something, someone, just beyond their sight. Jake's grip on her arm tightened, his eyes darting nervously around. He looked as though he might bolt, his nerves on edge. "This isn't normal, Sarah. We need to get out of here, now." But before either of them could take a step, the voice whispered again, colder, deeper, with a chilling sense of finality. "You can't leave." The air froze. Sarah's heart stopped in her chest, her entire body rigid with fear. The voice wasn't just speaking. It was commanding. It was pulling at them, as though it had them in its grasp. The storm was no longer the storm. The wind was no longer the wind. The voice wasn't an echo. It was something far darker, far older, and it had found them, and now it wasn't going to let them go. The words hung in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing against Sarah's chest like an invisible weight. "You can't leave." The voice was deep, resonating in the very bones of the mountain, chilling her to the core. It felt as if the words themselves had substance, as though they were wrapped in the cold winds, floating like smoke just beyond her reach. Jake was already backing up, his eyes wide with a wild panic that mirrored her own. He shook his head, his voice cracking with disbelief. This can't be happening. It's just the wind. It has to be." But even as he said it, he knew deep down that the air around them felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. Sarah, her breath shallow and ragged, took a step back, her feet unsteady on the snow-covered ground beneath the overhang. The world beyond the cliff was a blur of white, a blank canvas of swirling snow and frozen winds. The storm was still raging, but the silence that had descended upon them felt worse than the storm itself. It was a thick, suffocating kind of silence, one that made her stomach twist and her skin crawl. The darkness of the storm outside had seeped into their thoughts, into their very souls. The overhang, which had once been a refuge from the snow, now felt like a tomb, closing in around them. There was nowhere to run. The wind moaned, its howl rising and falling, a ghostly wail that sent a shiver through Sarah's spine. Her breath formed clouds of fog in the frigid air, but it was the voice echoing through her mind that haunted her. It was a voice she couldn't escape, no matter how she tried to block it out. The words repeated, clearer now, louder than the wind. "You can't leave." She felt the pulse of her own heartbeat in her throat, the fear tightening around her chest like a vice. She glanced at Jake, whose eyes were wide, frantic. He was holding onto his pack like it might somehow protect him, his face pale beneath the layers of snow and frost. The storm was no longer just a storm. It was as if the mountain itself had come alive, sentient and watching them. "You heard that, right?" Jake's voice was ragged, desperate. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from fear, the kind of fear that no amount of logic could explain away. That's not just wind or an echo. That's something else. something out. There. Sarah nodded, her mouth dry. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. The world had shifted in an instant. What had once been a simple hike, an escape from the noise of their lives, had turned into something far darker. And now, they were trapped in the heart of the mountain with something that wasn't human, wasn't natural, watching them from the shadows. The voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a command. It was a question. Do you fear me? Sarah's stomach dropped. The voice wasn't just repeating their thoughts, it was speaking to them, directly. It was aware of them. It knew them. Jake flinched, as if the words had struck him physically. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The storm outside roared louder, and the air in their tiny shelter seemed to grow colder still, biting into their skin. I fear nothing, Jake finally managed to say, his voice trembling but defiant. We're not afraid of you. The words felt weak as soon as they left his lips. They didn't even sound like his voice anymore. Stripped of its usual confidence, it cracked under the weight of the atmosphere. Sarah wanted to shout, to scream that they weren't afraid either, but the truth was undeniable. She was terrified, not of the storm, not of the cold, but of the thing, the presence that was waiting just beyond their sight, pulling at the edges of their sanity. The mountain trembled again beneath them. The echo that followed felt as though it vibrated deep in the earth, rattling the stones, shaking the very bones of the mountain. A shadow, no, not a shadow, a shape, dark and shifting, passed in the corner of Sarah's vision, moving with unnatural speed. She turned her head quickly, her eyes scanning the dense white fog beyond the overhang. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the endless swirl of snow and wind. Her pulse quickened, her breath hitching in her throat. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for them. She could feel it watching, could sense its eyes on her, on both of them. And now she realized it wasn't just the storm. That was closing in. It was the thing that had been calling to them. The thing that had been here long before they ever arrived. Jake's voice shattered the silence. Sarah, I don't think we're alone. His eyes were fixed on something. Behind her, his gaze wild, searching as though trying to find something in the white chaos outside. Sarah turned instinctively, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a figure, tall, cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was a flash of movement, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make her stomach churn with dread. Doe. You see that, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded slowly, his lips pressed together in a grim line. I saw it too. The figure was gone in an instant, swallowed by the snow and wind. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't disappeared. It had moved. No, it had shifted, like it was never bound by the same rules as them. The storm outside grew louder, its fury escalating as if the very mountain was awakening, responding to the entity that had made itself known. The voice came again, but now it was different, familiar, like a twisted reflection of something they both knew. You think you can leave, but you are already mine. The words echoed with such finality that Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The ground beneath them quaked again, but this time it wasn't just a vibration. The rock above them groaned, the stone shifting as though something, no, someone, was moving through the mountain's very core. Jake staggered back, his eyes wide in disbelief. What the hell is this? I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. But I know one thing for sure, we have to get out of here. But the words barely left her lips before another crack rang out through the air. A voice, deep and familiar but twisted, distorted, reached out from the shadows. You can't leave. The words hit them like a punch to the stomach. You can't leave. There was no mistaking it now. This was no natural storm, no coincidence of sound and wind. This was something that had been waiting, something ancient and alive, something that had never meant for them to leave. The shadow, no, not a shadow, a presence, was closer now, filling the space around them, suffocating the small shelter beneath the overhang. The wind howled louder, the snow spinning faster, as though the very elements were bent to the will of whatever waited beyond their sight. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the dread that had been building with each passing second. Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too, something deep, something primal, the kind of fear that comes when a person knows they are no longer in control of their fate. Sarah. His voice was a whisper, hoarse and trembling. It's not just the storm, is it? We're not alone, not like we thought. He turned, searching the swirling white beyond their shelter, but there was nothing visible. Just snow, just wind, just the weight of the presence. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow as she watched him. She could feel it too. The air around them was thick, suffused with a tangible heaviness. The snow that fell so rapidly seemed to have a strange weight to it, like it wasn't just frozen water but something far darker, something tied to the very mountain itself. Suddenly, another tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet. This one was stronger, more insistent. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm to steady herself as the rock above them creaked, groaned, and shifted. The very mountainside seemed to be alive, the stone trembling as if it were a living being responding to something. Deep within, she could hear it now in the silence between the howling wind, the faintest scraping sound coming from deep within the rock, like claws against stone. "I don't like this," Jake whispered, his voice raw with panic. "We need to go. Now." But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark shape that seemed to materialize in the periphery of her vision, flickering in and out like a wisp of smoke. It wasn't a person, not fully. It was more like a shadow wrapped in shadow, a dark figure that seemed to move with unnatural fluidity, slipping between the layers of the storm. "Sarah." Jake's voice was desperate now, shaking her from her trance. "Look at me. We can't stay here. We have to get out." But even as he said it, a thought tugged at Sarah's mind, something that had been lingering since they first heard the voice. What if they couldn't leave? What if the mountain itself didn't want them to leave? The thought chilled her to the bone. She glanced at Jake, but the look on his face told her he had come to the same terrifying realization. Something in the air shifted, an oppressive weight that pressed down on them from all sides, as though the mountain itself was breathing, watching. Then a voice. Not the same voice as before. This one was lower, deeper, more malevolent. It seemed to crawl under Sarah's skin, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating shroud. "I've been waiting for you." The words were thick with malice, dripping with the kind of malevolence that made the air around them feel charged, like static electricity before a storm. Sarah's chest tightened with terror as the voice seemed to come from every direction. At once, a whisper in the wind, a murmur in the snow. Jake's grip on her arm tightened. "What the hell is that?" His voice cracked, raw with fear. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. The words felt inadequate, meaningless in the face of what they were experiencing. The storm outside wasn't the enemy. The mountain wasn't just a backdrop to their fear. The presence, the thing they had been hearing, the thing that had been calling them, was a part of the mountain itself, tied to its ancient heart. As if on cue, the ground beneath their feet rumbled again, stronger now, almost like an earthquake. The rock around them groaned, and the very cliff they sheltered beneath seemed to shift, as though something far beneath was stirring. awakening from a long slumber. And then, there it was again. The shadow. It was closer now, undeniable in its presence. It flickered between the snowflakes, a dark figure that moved within human speed, slipping between the edges of their vision like a nightmare they couldn't escape. It was watching them. No, waiting for them. Jake backed up further into the rock, his breath quick and shallow. We have to move. We have to run. But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the shifting darkness. The figure. Was it a person? A creature? Something older than the mountains themselves. It was impossible to say, but there was no denying its presence, its intentions. It was waiting for them, to make a mistake, to give it a reason to act. "You can't leave," the voice said again, the words so deep and resonant they seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. "You're already mine." The rocks overhead groaned in response, and the ground trembled again, harder this time. The snow outside swirled in a dizzying frenzy, and the air grew colder, colder than it should have been. The cold wasn't just from the storm. It was something far deeper, something unnatural. The shadow shifted, closer now, moving with a disturbing slowness. It was as if the very mountain had taken form, shaping itself into something that could hunt, something that could feel them. And it wasn't alone. The darkness around them seemed to multiply, taking on shape and substance, filling the space with a terrible sense of foreboding. Every movement they made, every breath they took, felt watched, as though the mountain itself was testing them to see how long they could hold out before breaking. Jake turned to her, eyes wild. "We can't just stay here, Sarah. We have to. Run, we have to." But before he could finish, a flash of blackness shot from the corner of her vision, and suddenly the figure was right in front of them. The shadows seemed to split open, revealing nothing but a void. The air was thick, suffocating, and then she saw it. A figure, tall and thin, wrapped in shadow, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. Its eyes, black, endless pits, glistened in the darkness. "I've been waiting for you," the voice repeated, this time echoing not just through the air, but through her very mind. The words were inside her, twisting, crawling through her thoughts like a poison. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The terror that gripped her throat was too tight, too suffocating. The shadow reached out, slow and deliberate. Its presence filled every inch of the small space under the overhang. The air around her seemed to throb, and for a moment she swore the very rock they huddled beneath was alive, a living, breathing thing. The figure's fingers brushed her cheek, cold as ice. But there was something else, a pressure, a crushing weight, pulling at her very soul. The darkness was closing in, and there was no escape. The cold wasn't just physical anymore. It was something deeper, something that sank into the marrow of their bones and twisted through their veins, freezing them from the inside out. The shadow before them loomed, an endless void that seemed to swallow the light. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only feel. A heavy, insistent pressure pressing against her chest, pushing down until it felt like her ribs might crack under the strain. It wasn't just the weight of the thing standing before them, it was the weight of the mountain itself, alive and aware, feeding on their fear, their desperation. The figure stretched forward, its hands, long, clawed and impossibly thin, reaching for Sarah's face. The air seemed to hum with an oppressive energy, the very stone beneath her feet vibrating as if the mountain was alive, was breathing with them, sharing in this twisted moment. Her legs felt like lead, like they couldn't move even if she tried. The world outside the overhang had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the blizzard, the winds howling, the snow blurring everything into an endless sheet of white. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. She turned to Jake, desperate for him to act, to do something. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but his body was rooted to the ground. The shadow had paralyzed them both with a terror, so deep it was beyond words. The mountain wasn't just a place they were visiting anymore. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that had waited for them, had drawn them here with the cold, with the storm, with the promise of the wilderness, and now it wouldn't let them go. The shadow's fingers hovered in the air, inches from her skin, colder than any ice she had ever felt. It was like a vacuum, sucking the warmth out of her very soul, drawing her closer, inch by inch. She could feel herself trembling, shaking, but she wasn't sure if it was the cold, or the thing's touch, or both. And then, in a voice so soft, it was barely a whisper, the shadow spoke again. "You are mine." It was not a command. It was a truth, one that reverberated through her bones and down into the deepest parts of her mind, an undeniable fact. Sarah's vision blurred, the edges of the world dimming, her head swimming with dizziness. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall. No, the pressure around her was too strong, too suffocating. It wasn't just the shadow pulling at her. It was the mountain itself, like the earth was lashing out, binding her to its will. Jake staggered back a step, his hand reaching out for her. But it was no use. The air between them seemed to thicken, the weight of the mountain pressing down on them, separating them. The sound of the storm, once so fierce and maddening, now faded into nothingness. There was no wind, no snow, no world beyond the rocks. Only the shadow and the crushing, suffocating silence. The figure's hand finally touched her cheek. Cold, so cold, like ice carved from the core of the earth itself. It was unnatural, its skin smooth and slick like polished stone, but not human. Not anything human. It didn't belong here in the world of flesh and bone. It was ancient, timeless, something that had existed long before the mountains themselves had taken shape. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold seeping into her chest, into her heart, until she felt as though she might stop breathing altogether. But even as her body screamed in protest, as her instincts begged her to flee, she could not move. She was trapped in the grip of something so old, so vast, that she couldn't even begin to comprehend it. The shadow leaned closer, its presence growing, filling the space, its breath icy against her skin. "I've waited for you," it rasped, the voice a low, guttural murmur that seemed to echo within her very bones. "For so long, the mountain calls, and you have answered." It was then, as the last vestiges of her strength drained away, that Sarah understood. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a creature, a thing with its own hunger, its own need, and it fed on those who wandered too close, who came seeking its solitude, its peace. It was not simply the storm, not just the snow. It was the mountain itself, a force as ancient as the earth, feeding on their fear, binding them to its eternal hunger. Jake's voice broke through the silence, raw and frantic. "Sarah!" He reached for her again, his voice hoarse with desperation. "We have to get out of here. Come on, we have to move." But it was too late. The moment he spoke, the shadow flickered, its presence expanding, wrapping around her like a shroud. She could see it now, feel it, the mountain itself, the deep, eternal darkness that pulsed beneath its stone heart. It was as if the mountain was waking up, stretching its limbs, and they were the prey. And then, with a sudden jolt, the world shifted. The shadow's hand withdrew from Sarah's face, but the change wasn't in the relief of its departure. No. It was as if the earth itself had turned its gaze upon her, as if the very mountain had opened its eyes, and it was now seeing her for what she truly was. She was a part of it, a piece of the puzzle that it had been waiting for, that it had been drawing closer with every passing moment. The voice came again, softer this time. but it held an undeniable certainty. You are part of me now. Sarah's stomach turned. She wasn't sure if she was going to throw up or scream or simply collapse, but the terror that clawed at her insides told her it didn't matter. She was already ensnared. She could feel it, feel the mountain moving beneath. Her feet feel its weight pulling her deeper, pulling her into its abyss. Jake grabbed her arm, yanking her, his voice a panicked rasp. We have to run, Sarah. We can't stay here. We can't stay. But the moment his hand touched hers, the ground beneath them rumbled again, more violently this time, and Sarah was struck with the horrifying realization that they weren't just dealing with an entity, with a force. They were dealing with the very soul of the mountain itself. It had its claws in them now, its grip tightening with every heartbeat. Jake's eyes locked with hers, his face pale with terror. And in that moment, Sarah knew. The mountain wasn't going to let them go, no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they ran. They were already part of it. They were. It's now. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling like a mournful cry. But inside the small shelter beneath the cliff, all Sarah could hear was the beating of her own heart, slow and heavy, as the presence pressed in on all sides. The mountain was alive, and it was feeding. The moment stretched like an eternity. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the depths of the mountain. The sound of the storm outside, the shrieking wind, faded away as if they had stepped into a different world altogether. It was only the hum of the mountain that remained, low and constant, vibrating through the rock, through the air. She could feel it in her bones now, this pulse of the earth, this ancient, unyielding presence that had been waiting for them. They were no longer visitors to these mountains. They were its. Jake's grip on her arm tightened, and for a moment, it was the only real thing left in the world. The warmth of his fingers, the terror in his eyes, the rawness of his voice as he tugged at her. Sarah, we have to move. Now. But no matter how hard he pulled, it felt like the world around them had grown too heavy, as if they were stuck in some viscous, unseeable force that wouldn't let them go. Sarah's feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Her limbs were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the suffocating weight of the presence surrounding them, pulling at them, holding them in place. The shadow flickered again in the corner of her vision. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was a thing, a creature, made of pure darkness, moving with an unnatural grace. It slithered between the snowflakes, drawing closer with every passing second, its eyes hidden beneath the hood, its form shifting and warping in the corners of her vision. The darkness wanted them. It was feeding on them, on their fear, their confusion, their helplessness. Sarah! Jake's voice was sharper now, desperate. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he pulled harder, but it was no use. She couldn't move. She couldn't do anything but stand there, paralyzed by the weight of the mountain's grip on her. The shadow loomed larger, its form becoming clearer, its body stretching and twisting like smoke, no longer bound by the laws of the physical world. It was the very essence of the mountain itself, a manifestation of its hunger, its desire for souls, for warmth, for life. And it was reaching for them, its long fingers swaying in the air like tendrils of some ancient, unfathomable creature. Its presence pressed in on them, suffocating, consuming. You belong to me now, the voice echoed, not just in the air but in their minds, a soundless whisper that made Sarah's skin crawl. You are a part of me. She wanted to scream, to push Jake away and run, but every part of her body refused to obey. Her legs were frozen, her muscles like lead, and the mountain, the presence, it was feeding on her. The cold seeped deeper into her bones, as though the very marrow within her was turning to ice. She closed her eyes, clenching her teeth, and the storm howled around them. But it wasn't enough to block out the voice, the presence that had fully consumed the space between them. She felt it now, a pull deep in her chest, like the mountain was sinking its claws into her very soul, dragging her further into its abyss. Jake's eyes locked with hers, wild and pleading. "Sarah, please, we can't stay here." He tried, again to drag her away, but it was like trying to pull against the very rock itself. It was pointless. There was nowhere to go. And then, something inside Sarah snapped. It wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just the terror. It was something deeper, something tied to her past, something unresolved, something she had been running from for years. The mountain wasn't just pulling at them. It was feeding on them because of them. It was feeding on their guilt. She could feel it now. It wasn't just the shadow, it wasn't just the storm. It was her too. The mountain had drawn them here for a reason. It wasn't just seeking any victims, it had chosen them. Her mind flashed to moments, broken fragments of her life. She saw her mother's face, her father's voice, the emptiness that had followed them since they died, the years of grief and loss, the guilt that had eaten at her like a slow burning fire, the feeling that she had never truly escaped them. The mountain had known that. The presence had felt it. It had sensed her pain, her loneliness, and it had drawn her here just as it had drawn Jake. It had waited for her to reach the end of her tether, to be so lost, so broken, that she would willingly fall into its grasp. The shadow flickered again, moving closer, and this time Sarah did not fight it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. She wasn't sure who she was apologizing to anymore. Was it to Jake, to herself, to the memory of her family? She didn't know. All she knew was that the mountain had always been there, buried deep within her, and now it was consuming her, from the inside out. She could feel the pull of it, the way it was tying her to the land, to the stone, to the ancient, inescapable hunger of the earth. Jake's grip on her arm tightened, his eyes full of panic. "Sarah, no. You can't." But it was already too late. The presence was no longer something outside of her. It was in her. It had always been in her. And now it had taken hold of both of them. The shadow reached out, its fingers brushing Sarah's face once more. This time, there was no cold, no pain. Only the pull, the sinking feeling, as if she were falling through the rock, through the earth itself. Her body seemed to shift, to fade, as though she were losing herself to the mountain. Jake tried to pull her back, but his efforts were futile. The stone beneath them rumbled once more, and the earth seemed to open, its gaping maw pulling them in, drawing them closer to the center of the mountain. Sarah could hear Jake shouting, but his voice was distant, muffled, as though the world was closing in on them, swallowing them whole. And then, as the last vestiges of the world outside the overhang faded, as the shadows consumed her mind completely, Sarah realized with a terrible clarity that the mountain was alive. It was not just a place. It was a consciousness, a being, a creature that had existed long before human history had even begun. It had always been waiting for the right souls, for the right pain, for the right loss. And now, it had her. It had them both. The last thing Sarah felt was the silence. The crushing, suffocating silence of the mountain, the quiet that followed the storm that had not passed, but had simply changed. The mountain had claimed them. The darkness engulfed her, not like the quiet of sleep, not like the stillness of night. No, this was something deeper, something far colder, as though the very fabric of time and space had unraveled around her. Sarah's body felt weightless, suspended in some vast, intangible void. Her breath had become shallow, slow, barely there, as though even the act of drawing air was an effort that her body had forgotten how to perform. There were no sounds, not the storm, not the howling wind, or the crackling of the snow outside. It was all gone. There was only the hum, the deep, persistent hum of the mountain itself. It throbbed beneath her skin, through her veins, filling her mind, suffusing every part of her with its ancient presence. The mountain had taken them. Both of them. But where were they now? Were they alive? Were they dead? Her mind struggled to grasp the reality of it, the impossibility of what had happened. She felt the mountain's pulse in her chest, slow, steady, unyielding. It was as if the stone itself had replaced her heart, a cold, lifeless thing, an object devoid of warmth, of feeling. And yet she felt it, she knew it. The stone was inside her, in her blood, in her thoughts, like a parasite feeding on her awareness. It was too much to bear. Her mind rebelled against the sensation. Her instincts screamed to flee, to fight, but there was nowhere to go. The mountain had closed in around them, and now it was waiting for them to fade. A figure, a shadow. She could see it, though her eyes were closed, though her body was motionless. It loomed in the distance, faint, undefined, but there, nonetheless. It was like a memory, like a ghost, something familiar, something she should know. The figure reached for her, and even in this place, she could feel it, a pull toward it, an inevitable draw. "Jake," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words made any sound. Was she even speaking, or was she only thinking? The air around her seemed to press in as if to drown her words, to silence her. But then, a voice. Not the deep, gravelly voice from before. No, this was different. It was familiar. It was Jake. "Sarah," the voice rasped, distant but unmistakable. His voice. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. She wasn't completely swallowed by the mountain yet. "Jake." Her throat tightened with the effort of speaking, as though the very act of trying to connect to the outside world was a struggle against the mountain's will. And then there was movement. The shadow, the figure, whatever it was, shifted, pulling her toward it with an invisible force, dragging her through this vast, suffocating void. She wanted to resist. She wanted to scream. But her body, so heavy with the mountain's weight, refused to obey. It felt like she was being pulled from one reality into another, each step, each breath, a heavy, burdensome act. The shadow solidified before her, and it was no longer vague, no longer a distant idea. It was Jake. But he wasn't right. He looked wrong. His eyes were sunken, his skin too pale, too thin. He was fading, just like her. "Jake," she whispered again, her voice trembling, echoing in the silence. "What's happening? What are we?" But Jake didn't answer. He only looked at her with hollow eyes, eyes that seemed to see through her, to see into the very depths of the earth itself. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only the faintest rustling, like the whisper of wind in the trees, the faintest memory of something long forgotten. And then she understood. Jake wasn't really there. He was a part of the mountain too. The mountain had claimed them both, drawing them into this suffocating silence. She wasn't hearing him. She wasn't speaking to him. She was hearing the echo of him. The mountain had taken his soul just as it had taken hers. They were no longer flesh. They were no longer human. They were now part of the mountain's endless hunger. Their bodies, their spirits, were part of the dark, living rock that would remain here forever. Her chest tightened. Panic clawed at her throat. The realization was a suffocating weight, an unbearable truth. They weren't going to leave. There was no way out. The mountain had no exit. It wasn't a place. They were part of it now. A part of its eternal, timeless hunger. You are mine now." The voice came again, this time in unison with the beating of her heart, as though the very words were woven into her very essence. She wanted to scream, she wanted to rip herself free, but there was nothing left of her to fight with. She was no longer Sarah. She was no longer Jake. She was a part of the mountain now, a reflection of its hunger, its pain, its need. And then, with a terrible clarity, Sarah saw it. The thing that had been waiting for them all along. It was not the shadow, not the figure of Jake that had been in front of her. No, it was deeper than that. It was the mountain itself. The mountain was not just alive. It was the echo of something older, far older than the earth itself. It was a force, a presence that had existed long before human history had ever taken shape. A hunger that had never been sated, a consciousness that had been sleeping beneath the stone, beneath the rock, feeding on the lost and the broken. It was a living thing, waiting to be fed, waiting to be awakened by those who came seeking peace, seeking solitude. And it had found them. It had found Sarah and Jake. The figure of Jake before her flickered, like a shadow that was fading. She reached out, but her hand passed right through him. The weight in her chest grew heavier, the pressure from the mountain's pull relentless, suffocating. She understood now. The mountain didn't just take, it absorbed. Her mind spun as the dark whispers of the mountain, of the entity that controlled. It filled her thoughts. She could feel the tendrils of its power reaching deep into her mind, tearing through the remnants of her consciousness, and as the darkness of the void surrounded her, it all became clear. The mountain did not need her, so it was feeding on the essence of who she was, her fear, her grief, her loss. She had been broken, and now the mountain would claim every fractured part of her, until there was nothing left but an echo, the echo of her voice, the echo of Jake's, the echo of every soul that had ever been claimed by this ancient, eternal hunger. And Sarah understood that she too had become part of the mountain's story, forever. The silence that enveloped Sarah now was not just empty, it was suffocating. The darkness had swallowed the remnants of her mind, the echoes of Jake's voice, the very fabric of the world she had once known. There was only the vastness of the mountain now, stretching endlessly, its cold fingers wrapped tightly around her spirit, claiming her as one of its own. In the deep recesses of the mountain, Sarah could still hear the pulse. The heartbeat of the earth, slow and steady, vibrating through her bones, syncing with the rhythm of her own breath. It was impossible to escape, as if the mountain had woven itself into the very essence of her being. The pull of it, the weight of its presence, was so heavy, so unyielding, that she had long since stopped fighting. There was no point. She was part of it now. But then, something flickered within her. A faint, distant memory. A whisper of the person she had once been. The fleeting sense of who she was before this, before the mountain had claimed her. It was so faint, so fragile, like a dream that was already slipping away upon waking. Jake. His name, barely a thought, reverberated in the dark corners of her mind. She had heard him. His voice had been real, hadn't it? The terror in his eyes, the desperation in his touch, those had been real. But the shadows had taken him too, just as they had taken her. Her chest tightened with an aching grief. Was he lost like her now? Was he still somewhere in the dark corners of this vast, alive thing? Or had he already been consumed, his soul turned to dust by the insatiable hunger of the mountain? The thought of him, of their shared humanity, was the last tether that held her to the world she had known. the last piece of herself that had not yet been claimed. It flickered, a single spark in the void, before it too began to fade, slowly, like the last embers of a dying fire. But then there was a shift. The heartbeat of the mountain grew louder, almost deafening now. The pull on her spirit intensified. The mountain moved. No, it wasn't the mountain. It was the presence, the ancient living force beneath the stone. It had noticed the flicker of her resistance, and now it was rushing to claim it, to stamp out the last remnants of her will. But as the weight of its power pressed in around her, something inside Sarah stirred. A voice. It was hers. A sound so faint, so fragile, she almost couldn't believe it. But it was there. It was the last echo of herself, the last bit of her that hadn't yet been consumed by the mountain's hunger. She could hear it calling from somewhere deep, within her, rising from the abyss. I am still here. Her chest felt tight, but she could feel it. A spark, a glimmer of light pushing through the suffocating darkness. Her voice, her will was still alive. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to fight back, even just for a moment. And in that moment, something cracked. The grip of the mountain loosened, just slightly, enough to let a sliver of space open between its grasp and the echo of Sarah's soul. She could see, just for an instant, the shadows retreating from her vision. The storm that had raged outside, the fierce wind and the biting cold had softened, just a touch, as if the mountain had grown aware of her resistance. Sarah's body, though still imprisoned by the mountain's will, began to feel lighter. Her thoughts began to focus again, to center on one single thing: the connection to Jake, to her own past, to the life she had once led. She realized with a flash of clarity that the mountain did not simply feed on those who came to it. It fed on the loss, the grief, the pain of those it claimed. It thrived on remembrance. The more she clung to the memory of who she had been, the stronger the mountain's grip would become. But if she could let go, if she could release the last remnants of her past, perhaps then the mountain would lose its power over her. Her heart, no longer a real organ, no longer a human thing, beat with an urgency she couldn't fully understand. The grip around her spirit was still there, still heavy and cold, but now it seemed to waver. It was as though the mountain, the entity, was confused, uncertain, suddenly unsure of its claim. The shadow flickered again, stronger now, as if it were trying to reform itself, to find its purchase in the fissures of Sarah's consciousness. But Sarah's will began to grow, despite the odds, despite the mountain's hunger, despite its ancient consuming power. She thought of Jake again, of his warmth, his life, the memories of their time together, their friendship, their shared laughter, all of it. It filled her mind with a blinding clarity, a clarity she had not allowed herself to feel since the storm had first descended upon them. I am still here. With a force she did not know she had, Sarah let go. She released the grief, the guilt, the pain. She let them fall away, like leaves in the wind, scattered and gone, until all that was left was the echo of her own voice. In that instant, the mountain shuddered. The ground trembled beneath her, as if something, someone, had struck at its very core. A wave of energy, not dark but bright, pulsed through her. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The presence, the shadow, the mountain, everything shook, as though the very fabric of it was unraveling. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence was gone. The hum, the heartbeat, the suffocating weight, all of it vanished. The stone that had once pressed in on her chest seemed to lift. The storm outside, the one that had raged so violently, faded into a quiet, still calm. The darkness retreated. Sarah opened her eyes. The storm had passed. She was standing at the edge of the overhang once again. as if no time had passed at all. The blizzard had ended, and the world beyond was vast and still, bathed in the pale light of dawn. She looked around, disoriented, her breath coming in shallow, gasping bursts. The snow beneath her feet was untouched, pristine, and the air, though cold, felt clean. There was no shadow, no figure standing beside her, just the wind howling faintly as it swept through the mountains. But in the distance, she thought she saw something, just a flicker of movement, a figure, so faint and far away that it could have been a trick of the light. She blinked, and it was gone. The mountain had released her. But she knew, deep down, that it was never truly over. The mountain had claimed her once, and perhaps someday it would come again. But for now, she was free.